Late on the night of the 13th of October 2008, a 43-year-old woman named Hua Si sat in her parked car. She was in a dark, quiet area just off the side of Highway 61 inches, New Taipei City, Taiwan. She took a moment for herself, rolling down her driver's side window and then turning off the engine. For just a few seconds, she sat perfectly still, letting the warm night breeze blow across her face. It wasn't often she got a moment completely alone. Back home, she had three children, and life was always busy, always filled with noise and responsibility. So she just savored the silence, the simple feeling of being by herself under the night sky. After a little while, she turned her attention to the center console. There was a piece of paper sitting there. She picked it up, and with deliberate movements, she began tearing it into tiny little pieces. Once the paper was nothing but confetti in her hands, she tossed the scraps out of the open window. But as she did, a gust of wind blew back at just the right moment, and it carried a few of those ripped-up pieces right back inside her car. They fluttered down and settled in the storage pocket on the driver's side door, unnoticed. A little while later, around 3 in the morning, a Coast Guard officer was making his regular nighttime patrol along that same stretch of Highway 61. It was a routine drive, one he had done countless times. He passed under a large overpass and entered a section of the highway where the streetlights were few and far between. The road ahead was mostly shrouded in darkness. And it was there, in the deep shadows, that he saw something that didn't look right. There was a gray sedan, and it was parked awkwardly, with 2 wheels on the pavement and 2 wheels on the dirt shoulder. The officer was immediately curious. He slowed his vehicle and pulled up behind the sedan, parking and cutting his engine. He got out to take a closer look. The sedan's lights were off, and the engine was silent. His first thought was that maybe the car had been abandoned. But as he walked closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, he saw that the driver's side window was wide open. He peered inside, and even in the low light, he could make out the shape of a person. It looked like a woman, and she was sitting upright in the driver's seat. The officer figured she must have fallen asleep. So he took out his heavy-duty flashlight and shined the bright beam directly into the car, hoping to wake her up. But the moment the light hit her, he stumbled back in shock. The woman was not asleep. Her entire head and the upper part of her chest were soaked in blood. Just a few minutes later, a police officer named Guo Hu Wen arrived on the scene. He was joined by a small team of other officers and several emergency medical technicians. The EMTs moved in quickly, but it only took them a moment to confirm what everyone there already knew. The woman inside the car was dead. They pointed out a small, circular wound just below her left ear. To the experienced officers on the scene, it was instantly recognizable as a bullet wound. Officer Guo immediately ordered his men to spread out and secure the area, setting up a police cordon to preserve any evidence. Once the scene was locked down, the investigation began in earnest. The first thing Guo did was take a closer, more careful look at the woman's body and her immediate surroundings. He noticed a single bullet casing lying on the ground near the open car door. Inside the car, he could see what looked like tiny fragments of shiny metal, possibly pieces of copper from the bullet itself. But there was no gun anywhere to be found. And so, at that moment, Officer Guo and his team knew they weren't dealing with a suicide or an accident. This was a murder. But as he stood there, taking in the whole scene, something felt very wrong to him. The entire setup just seemed off. First, he looked at the ground behind the car's tires. There were no skid marks, no signs of a sudden stop or a panicked maneuver. It looked as if the woman had pulled over calmly and in a completely controlled way. It didn't seem like she'd been forced off the road by another vehicle. Second, there was the window. The driver's side window was all the way down. This meant that either she had been driving with it down from the start, or she had rolled it down after she pulled over. Either way, it was a strange detail for someone who was about to be attacked. And third, and perhaps most unsettling, there was absolutely no evidence of a struggle. There were no scuff marks on the car's interior, no defensive wounds on the woman, nothing to suggest she had fought back or had even been panicked in her final moments. She hadn't even dropped her phone, which was still in its holder. Her seatbelt was still fastened. Overall, it just seemed like this woman had been remarkably calm right before she was shot. It was as if she had absolutely no idea she was about to be killed. This one single detail led Officer Guo to an early but strong theory. Whoever shot her was very likely somebody she knew, somebody she trusted enough to roll her window down for in the middle of the night on a deserted highway. Guo knew his next step was crucial. He had to identify this woman, and then he needed to find out who was close to her. He wrote down the car's license plate number and was just about to have an officer run it through the system to find the registered owner. But just then, another officer came running over to him looking excited. He told Guo they had found something really strange inside the car. He wasn't sure if it was related to the crime, but he knew Guo needed to see it. Inside the pocket on the driver's side door, they had found 4 small scraps of paper. Each scrap had what looked like numbers or fragments of words handwritten on them. The fragments read 65, Dalo, Z, and Da. On their own, none of these fragments seemed to mean anything. They were likely part of a larger piece of paper that was now missing. In fact, some of the words were just pieces of words, not complete thoughts. The officers tried arranging the 4 pieces in different combinations, trying to see if they could form a coherent message, but they couldn't. It all just seemed like nonsense. Officer Guo figured the scraps were probably just garbage that had been in the car for a while. But he was a thorough investigator. As a precaution, he had his officers carefully bag the 4 tiny pieces of paper as evidence. You just never knew. A few hours later, Officer Guo and a member of his team walked into a huge apartment complex in New Taipei City. They were about 40 miles away from the desolate stretch of highway where they had found the woman's body earlier that morning. They made their way to a specific apartment and knocked on the door. After a moment, a middle-aged man opened it. He looked very surprised to see 2 police officers standing in his hallway. Officer Guo asked the man if his name was Shu Bi Chung, and the man nodded and confirmed that it was. By this point, Guo and his team had identified the murder victim. She was 43-year-old Hua Si. And when they had started looking into her personal life and relationships, they learned that she lived in this very apartment with her 3 children and the man who had just opened the door, Shu Bi Chung. He was her ex-husband. The records showed the couple had officially divorced 5 years earlier, but for reasons unknown at the time, they had decided to continue living together to co-parent their children. As Hua's ex-husband, living in the same home, Shu was an obvious person of interest. But Officer Guo had to be careful. He had no idea how much Shu already knew or what his involvement might be. He needed to approach the conversation delicately. Officer Guo started by introducing himself and his partner. He then asked Shu if he had spoken to his ex-wife recently. Shu shook his head and said that he hadn't spoken to her since the previous night. But then he added that their last conversation had definitely been strange. He explained that the previous night, around 8:45 p.m., Hua had left the apartment to go to a meeting. She was supposed to meet with a pawn shop owner on the other side of the city. Shu said that she owed this pawn shop owner a lot of money, and the meeting was to discuss a repayment plan. But then, around 9:30 p.m., while she was on her way, Hua had called him. She told him she was on Highway 61 and that another car was following her. Shu told Officer Guo that he had tried to calm her down. He had told her that it was very likely just another driver heading in the same direction, that it was probably a coincidence and nothing to worry about. He said that Hua had seemed to agree with him and then hung up the phone. According to Shu, he tried calling Hua back a little while later just to check on her, but she didn't pick up. Shu then claimed he called her an additional 10 more times after that, but she never once answered. And so, Shu said, he really didn't know what had happened to his ex-wife. He didn't know if she made it to the meeting. He didn't know where she was now. After hearing this story, Officer Guo's first reaction was one of complete disbelief. The story just sounded absurd. If Shu truly believed that Hua was being followed at night while she was alone on her way to a high-stakes meeting with a creditor, and then she suddenly stopped answering her phone, why on earth wouldn't he have called the police? Or at the very least, why wouldn't he have gotten in his own car and tried to go look for her? Instead, according to his own account, he had just called her a bunch of times, and when she didn't answer, he just shrugged it off and went about his night. It seemed like a bizarrely passive reaction for someone whose ex-wife, the mother of his children, was potentially in serious danger. So, Officer Guo watched Shu very carefully as he delivered the terrible news. He told him that he was very sorry, but early that morning, they had found his ex-wife. She had been murdered inside her car on the side of the highway. When Shu heard this, his eyes went wide and his body began to tremble. From Guo's perspective, it looked like a genuine, shocked response. It looked like a man who couldn't believe the awful words he was hearing. But at the same time, Guo was a seasoned detective. He couldn't fully read the man. He couldn't be sure if this display of grief was genuine or if Shu was just performing for him. Either way, Guo knew what he had to do next. He needed to follow up on every part of Shu's story and see if he could find any holes in it. Following the interview, Guo and his team asked the manager of the apartment complex for any available surveillance footage. They wanted to see if Hua really did leave the apartment at the time Shu claimed she did. The manager was cooperative and was able to pull up some footage from the camera inside the complex's elevator. The footage did indeed prove that Hua left around 8:45 p.m., just like Shu had said. But it also showed something else, something that struck Officer Guo as deeply strange. In the video, Hua gets on the elevator, supposedly on her way to meet this pawn shop owner. But for some reason, her ex-husband Shu rode the elevator down with her. And during this short ride, Shu leaned in and kissed Hua for 8 full seconds. Then he hugged her tightly and held her until the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened. Now, to an outsider, this might just look like a tender moment between a loving couple, but in this context, it was very odd for 2 reasons. First, Hua and Shu were divorced. As far as Officer Guo understood it, they were not a romantic couple anymore. Their living arrangement was one of convenience for their children. And second, it was weird because in Taiwanese culture, public displays of affection like that are very uncommon, especially among the older generations. It would be highly unusual for a middle-aged couple to kiss and hug so passionately anywhere except in the privacy of their own home. So, watching this footage, Officer Guo felt that the only explanation that made sense for Shu's behavior was that he knew something terrible was about to happen to his ex-wife. It looked like he was saying goodbye. As they continued to investigate Shu's story, they found even more problems with it. They tracked down the pawn shop owner that Shu had mentioned. The man did exist, and he confirmed that Hua did owe him a significant amount of money. But when police asked him about the meeting, he said he had no idea what they were talking about. He insisted he had no meeting scheduled with her at all that night. Police also managed to get access to surveillance footage from a traffic camera on Highway 61 near where Hua's body had been found. Now, the cameras didn't cover the exact spot where the murder took place, but they were able to get clear footage of Hua driving along the highway at 9:30 p.m., which was the exact time that Shu said she had called him, claiming she was being followed. But on this video, there was clearly no other car behind Hua. She was driving alone. Now, it was technically possible that Hua had lied to her ex-husband for some unknown reason, but to Officer Guo, it seemed much more likely that Shu was the one who was lying now. It seemed like he was making up the whole story about the car following his ex-wife to create a fictional attacker. After learning all of this, Officer Guo and his team went back and re-examined all the surveillance footage from the apartment complex. They also got a warrant for Shu's cell phone records, which included his GPS data, to see if they could track his movements on the night of the murder. but what they found only made the case more complicated. According to both the building's surveillance cameras and Shu's own cell phone pings, he had been inside his apartment all night. There was simply no way he was the one who drove out to Highway 61 and shot Hua. But to Officer Guo, this didn't mean Shu was innocent. It just changed the entire theory of the case. He wondered if maybe Shu had hired someone to commit the murder on his behalf. He didn't have any proof, but his gut told him Shu had to be involved. But that theory still left a lot of unanswered questions. Why would Shu have wanted Hua dead in the first place, especially if their relationship was amicable enough for that goodbye kiss? And even if he had hired a hitman, why would Hua have so calmly pulled over and opened her car window for a complete stranger? And so Officer Guo thought about it for a little while, and then he had an idea. Maybe the person Shu hired wasn't a stranger. Maybe the hitman was somebody Hua also knew and trusted. Several months had now passed. Officer Guo and one of his teammates were sitting inside a large office in a high-rise building in New Taipei City. They were seated in front of a huge, polished desk. Behind that desk sat the man who worked in this office. He was Hua's brother. Officer Guo and his team were still operating under the theory that whoever killed Hua likely knew her personally. So, for the last few months, they had been methodically tracking down and interviewing every single person in her cell phone's contact list. So far, the exhaustive process had not turned up any new suspects, but they had learned some very interesting things about Hua's life. It turned out that Hua hadn't just been in debt to that one pawn shop owner. She also owed money to multiple banks, to friends, and even to her own family members. She had even borrowed money from some very shady black market lenders. All told, her debt was staggering. It was the equivalent of nearly $500,000 US. Knowing about this massive debt actually made Hua and her ex-husband Shu's relationship make a lot more sense. Several people had told the police that the real reason Hua and Shu had gotten divorced was not because they had fallen out of love. It was a practical decision. Hua's credit was completely ruined because of all her debt, and Shu wanted to keep his own finances separate and protected from hers. By all accounts, the couple, despite being legally divorced, were still very much in love. They were devoted to each other and completely dedicated to their children. This new information had left Officer Guo and his team feeling like they were back at square one. Shu had initially seemed so suspicious, but Guo still had no hard evidence directly linking him to the murder. And now, with this new context, he didn't even seem to have a clear motive. So now, as Guo sat inside this sterile office across from Hua's brother, he was just hoping that some new piece of information, any small detail, would come to light. Guo and his partner asked the brother to please tell them everything he knew about Hua, her marriage, her financial problems, and anything else he thought might be relevant. The brother nodded slowly and began to talk. But pretty quickly, it became clear that what he was saying was just a repeat of all the other information that Guo already knew. It was the same stories, the same details. It was not new information. And so, as the brother continued to talk, Guo's mind began to wander. His eyes drifted away from the brother and began scanning the room. Eventually, his gaze landed on a bookshelf behind the brother's desk. He noticed a single piece of paper sticking out from between two thick books on the shelf. Guo could only see a small corner of it, but he could tell that there was handwriting on the paper, and the style looked strangely familiar. So, without saying a word, while Hua's brother was still talking, Guo stood up from his chair. He walked around the large desk to the bookshelf, and he pulled out that piece of paper. And as soon as he looked at it, his heart began to race. He saw that the handwriting on this piece of paper was the exact same handwriting that was on those 4 little scraps of paper they had found at the crime scene. The same scraps that they had almost dismissed as trash. He was looking at the same handwriting. But it was more than that. Guo could see that the actual words, or portions of words, and the number that were on those fragments were right here on this page. The scraps they found were 65 Dalo, Z, and Da. This paper had those exact same characters on it. It was instantly clear that he was looking at a duplicate, a complete copy of whatever document had been in Hua's car that got ripped up. Before, he only had 4 meaningless pieces of a puzzle. Now, he was finally looking at the full picture. And as Guo looked over this complete document, it was like everything just snapped into place. Those fragments, the ones that seemed like nonsense, were actually bits and pieces of street names and addresses. The full message that Guo was now looking at was a set of detailed geographical directions, and the directions, when followed, would lead a person to the exact spot on the side of Highway 61 where Hua was murdered. After this incredible discovery, the police very quickly figured out exactly what happened to Hua and who the mastermind behind her murder was. But amazingly, the mastermind was not Hua's brother, even though this damning document was found in his office. No, the truth of Hua's murder was far darker and far more tragic than anyone could have ever imagined. It all began 1 month before Hua's death. That was when 3 people who all wanted Hua dead met up to formulate a plan. Those 3 people were Hua's brother, Hua's ex-husband Shu, and the mastermind. Once the 3 of them were together, they began to work out the details. They all decided that none of them wanted to get their own hands dirty. So, they would hire a hitman to do the job for them. They decided that they would have the hitman kill Hua in a neutral, remote location. They would have her shot on the side of the highway. They even chose a specific date and time for her execution, a time when that particular section of the road would be almost completely empty and in an area where there were no surveillance cameras and very few streetlights. And so, on the night that Hua was scheduled to be killed, the reason her ex-husband Shu rode down the apartment elevator with her and hugged her and kissed her with such passion was because he knew exactly what was going to happen to her. He was saying goodbye for the last time. After Hua left the apartment, Shu contacted Hua's brother. The brother then made a phone call to the hitman they had hired. Then, the hitman used the set of directions the brother had written out for him, those same directions that Officer Guo had found in his office. The hitman used those directions to get to the predetermined location where they were going to kill Hua. And when he got there, he simply pulled his car off to the side of the road, cut his engine, and waited. A little while later, the hitman saw Hua's gray sedan drive past him and then come to a slow, controlled stop on the side of the road, exactly as planned. At this point, the hitman got out of his car. He walked up alongside Hua's car. Her window was already down. He pulled out a gun and he shot her. It would turn out that the third person who met up with the ex-husband and the brother, the person who wanted Hua dead, the true mastermind behind Hua's own execution, was Hua herself. The reason Hua had a copy of those directions in her car, the directions she ultimately ripped up and tried to throw away, was because she needed them to get to the place where she was going to be killed. This is why the hitman could just get out of his car, walk right up to her, and kill her without any fight, without any struggle. She had rolled down the window and was waiting for him. Police later determined that Hua had taken out a very large life insurance policy on herself. It was worth so much money that it would have paid off all of her massive debt and still left her family with a lot of money left over. She had planned her own murder as a final, desperate act of self-sacrifice in the hopes of giving her family a better life, free from the crushing weight of her debts. She had ultimately convinced her ex-husband and her brother to help her with the plan in exchange for a cut of the insurance money. But in the end, her tragic plan didn't work out. Because of the evidence uncovered by police, Hua's death was ultimately ruled a facilitated suicide, not a homicide. As a result, the life insurance company did not pay out a single dollar to her family. Shu, Hua's brother, and the hitman they hired all faced a number of charges, including facilitating suicide and fraud. For their roles in the tragic plot, they each received prison sentences of between 6.5 and 7 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On a Sunday afternoon, the 12th of March, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. was driving his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. Even though it was freezing cold and the air felt sharp against his face, Mike couldn't help but smile. He just loved being out here. Most of the year, Mike lived about 2 hours away in Wakefield, Massachusetts, but this place, Freedom, was special. His parents had a vacation house here, so he'd been coming up to this tiny lakeside community his whole life. It always felt like a second home, a place where he could get away from it all and just breathe. Recently, Mike had even bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just a little ways down the street from his parents. It was a huge accomplishment for him. He ran a successful cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he had poured years of hard work into building a good life for his wife, Michelle, and their 3 kids. Buying this second house felt like proof that all that work had paid off. But that same work had also created some problems in his marriage. Running a company meant long hours and a lot of responsibility. Michelle and the kids were often on their own, which meant she handled most of the parenting and household duties by herself. And she had recently made it very clear to Mike that even though his success was great, his constant absence was incredibly hard on her. As Mike was out on the lake, kind of thinking through all of this, he saw another ATV heading his way. As it got closer, he recognized the driver. It was Sean Fitzpatrick, the other major problem in his marriage. Sean was one of their neighbors up at the lake and had been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired and lived in Freedom full-time. Whenever the Zamitis were in town, Sean would come over for dinner or barbecues. He'd take their kids out on the boat. He was around so often that Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had discovered that his wife, Michelle, had been cheating on him with Sean. The news had completely shattered Mike. But he and Michelle had agreed they didn't want to give up on their marriage. They started going to therapy together and were trying to work through it. As for Mike and Sean, well, they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since Mike found out about the affair. Mike hated confrontation. It was just easier for him to avoid Sean altogether and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So now, seeing Sean driving right towards him, Mike's first instinct was to just turn his ATV around and speed away. But it was too late. Sean was already waving him down. Mike slowed to a stop and waited for Sean to pull up alongside him. Sean didn't waste any time. He told Mike he was glad he ran into him, that he'd been wanting to apologize for what happened last summer with Michelle. He said it wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just put it all behind them. Mike was genuinely surprised by how sincere Sean sounded. So he just said, "You know what? It's all good." He didn't mean it, of course. It definitely was not all good. But again, Mike was not a confrontational person. All he wanted was to end this awkward conversation and get away from Sean. He also genuinely needed to get going. He, Michelle, and the kids were supposed to be heading back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to help Michelle finish packing up the house. So Mike quickly told Sean he had to go. Before Sean could say anything else, Mike turned his ATV around and gunned it back across the ice toward his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked through the front door. The first thing he saw was a row of suitcases, all packed and lined up by the door. He realized Michelle had already done all the work. A moment later, she came into the room and gave him a kiss. She told him the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms, and then they could all head out in a few minutes. Just then, they heard a car horn beep twice from outside. Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew exactly who it was. It was Mike's parents. They had also been up in Freedom for the weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield that afternoon. Michelle found it amusing that Mike and his father couldn't seem to go a single day without talking to each other. Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name wasn't the only thing they shared. They were best friends and business partners. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. It was a family business, and Mike Jr. had never considered doing anything else. He'd gone straight into the concrete business right after high school, and he and his dad had been working side by side ever since. Like any business, Allstate Concrete had faced its share of struggles, including a stressful lawsuit from a former employee. But for the most part, the company was a huge success. Right now, they were busier than ever, working on a massive construction project in Boston. Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and talk a little business with his dad. He asked his father if he had called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet. Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing the next morning, and Mike wanted to make sure Chester would be there too. Chester worked for them part-time as a driver and a handyman. He was by far their most reliable employee, so whenever they had a busy week coming up, they always made sure to call Chester in. To Mike Jr.'s relief, his dad said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were all set for the morning. After a few more minutes of chatting, they all said their goodbyes. Mike Jr. told his dad he'd see him tomorrow. Just before 8 o'clock the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete in Wakefield. He was right on time. He saw he was the first one there, so he got out and hurried across the lot to get out of the rain. He unlocked the side door next to one of the large garage bays and went inside. The Allstate building was essentially a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks. But it also had an office upstairs where Mike and his father handled all their administrative work. After entering the garage, Mike went up the stairs that led to his office on the second level. He sat down at his desk and started reviewing the week's schedule. A few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the parking lot. Mike figured it was probably his father, since Chester often walked to the office. Then, Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes after that, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his own truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked right next to his son's. He got out and walked quickly toward the building's side door to escape the rain. But when he tried to push the door open, it got stuck. It would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it from the inside. He peered through the crack to see what was in the way, and his body went cold. There was a man lying face down on the floor inside, in the middle of a huge pool of blood. It was dark inside the building, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He didn't know who it was, but he had a gut feeling it wasn't his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dim light, he could tell this man had a different build. Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding in his chest. His only thought was to back away, pull out his cell phone, and call 911. After he got off the phone with the dispatcher, who told him help was on the way, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just stand there and wait for the police. There was someone, either dead or very badly hurt, inside his garage. And his son was likely somewhere inside too. His truck was parked right there. He had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. moved away from the blocked side door and walked over to one of the big roll-up garage doors. He pulled it open. Once it was up, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and started frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer. There was no sign of him anywhere on the main floor. Finally, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and sprinted up to the second floor office. As soon as he burst through the office door, he stopped dead in horror. There, slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled his car up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already surrounded by yellow caution tape. There were at least a dozen crime scene techs and officers from the Wakefield Police Department moving in and out of an open garage door, carefully collecting evidence. Baker wasn't a Wakefield officer, he was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, it was standard procedure for state troopers to conduct homicide investigations alongside the local authorities. And Baker had a strong feeling this case would need all the help it could get. A town like Wakefield just didn't see many homicides. It was located about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation for being a peaceful, safe place. It was the kind of small town where everybody seemed to know each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and started looking for the officer in charge. He didn't have to look for long. An officer quickly approached him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police. Cass told Baker to follow him. As they walked toward the open garage door, he gave Baker a quick briefing on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, both deceased. Both had been shot. They had been discovered by the company's owner, Michael Zamidi Sr., a little after 8 o'clock that morning. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was lying face down on the concrete floor just inside that smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. Identifying him hadn't been difficult. Chester was well known around town for doing handyman work, and he was known personally by many of the local officers, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker examined the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It looked like a single shot, most likely from a shotgun, given the spray pattern of pellets that had entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, and importantly, no defensive wounds. As Baker stood up and scanned the garage, he also didn't see any signs of a robbery or a struggle. There was expensive-looking equipment sitting all around, but nothing was knocked over or out of place. Baker's initial thought was that Chester's killer had probably snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even knew what was happening. Baker spent a few more minutes checking the doors and windows. Again, he saw no signs of forced entry or anything else out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up the shop for the day and started his work, and the killer could have just walked in right after him. After finishing his initial assessment of the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to head upstairs to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second-floor office, where the body of 9-year-old Mike Zamidi Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he also knew Mike personally. Mike Jr. hadn't just been shot in the torso like Chester, he'd been shot in the face as well as the chest. The force of the shotgun blasts had been so powerful that his desk and all the surrounding paperwork were drenched in blood. For the most part, Mike's features were unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most wasn't just how gruesome the scene was. It was the fact that Mike Jr. was still slumped in his office chair. It looked like the killer had come up here with a very specific purpose: to execute Mike. They had marched straight into the office, ignored everything else, and shot Mike point blank in the face before he even had a chance to stand up. This felt incredibly intentional. Somebody had come here specifically to kill Mike. As Baker processed this, a theory began to form in his mind. This likely meant that Mike Jr. was the first one shot, probably before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike would have heard the loud shotgun blast from downstairs and wouldn't have been so caught off guard just sitting at his desk. If Mike was indeed the first victim, it further suggested he was the primary target of this attack. The crime scene, while gruesome, was remarkably clean in other ways. There were no bloody footprints or any other indication that the killer had lingered or interacted with the scene. Given the Italian-American family's involvement in the construction business, the thought of a mafia connection was hard to ignore. Baker mentioned his thoughts to Cass as he continued to survey the office. As Cass listened, a thoughtful expression came over his face. He said he knew the Zamidis pretty well and that Mike Jr. and his father were genuinely good people. He found it hard to believe they could be involved in any kind of shady mafia business. But he had to admit that it was a possibility, especially since the Zamidis were contractors on a project known as the Big Dig. This detail immediately made Baker's ears perk up. The Big Dig was, at the time, the largest construction project in the entire country. It involved building a massive tunnel under the harbor in Boston, but the project had become a total disaster for the city. It was way over budget, had been going on for 15 years, and still wasn't finished. The project had also become infamous for its connections to mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now, Baker had to seriously consider whether the Zamitis had either gotten involved in these seedy deals or had perhaps accidentally angered the wrong person on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker was still convinced that the killer was somehow connected to their business. It had to be someone who had maybe worked at Allstate Concrete or perhaps a client. Someone who would know Mike's routine, where his office was in the building, and that he would be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the main target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he had been killed. He could have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe he was somehow caught up in the same conflict as the Zamitis. For a moment, Baker just stood there, staring at the scene, at the blood-soaked paperwork scattered across the desk. Then he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent a little more time walking around the office looking for any other evidence. He noticed a 1.6 gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He called over a nearby tech and told her to bag it and to search for any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed back outside, where a crowd of onlookers had already started to gather behind the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by interviewing the person who had discovered the bodies, Michael Zamiti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained that when he had first arrived at the scene, Michael Sr. had been so distraught over finding his son that he could barely speak. So, Cass had simply sent him home. Another Wakefield officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zamiti, showed up at the scene, completely hysterical. She had heard there was an accident, and when officers told her that her husband was dead, they had taken her home as well. Baker understood, but he wasn't happy to hear it. He always preferred to speak to witnesses and family members as quickly as possible and in person. In any murder investigation, a spouse is always a potential suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed the opportunity to speak with Michelle right away. But there was still plenty of work to do at the scene, and he knew the Wakefield police would know where to find the family later. So, Baker turned to Cass and suggested they start canvassing the nearby businesses. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. Detective Cass was with him. They were there to speak with Mike Sr. They had just received the autopsy reports for both Chester and Mike, but the reports didn't reveal anything they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both had died within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential new lead from their canvassing of the neighborhood. Even though there were no surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete itself, some of these surrounding businesses did have them. Baker had officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team of detectives interviewing Chester Roberts' family because there was still an outside chance that Baker had it all wrong and that Chester was actually the intended target. Besides that, the crime scene technicians hadn't found much physical evidence. There were no usable fingerprints, and because it had been raining on the day of the murders, they hadn't been able to collect any clear footprints or tire tracks from outside the building. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Zamiti house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass were sitting in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents were incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just sat there, quietly crying. Seeing how upset they still were, Baker realized that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home the day before. Even a full 24 hours later, it was clear it was going to be difficult to get any solid information from them. So, Baker decided to keep the interview brief. The first thing he did was ask Mike Sr. to walk him through the discovery of the bodies. He just wanted to hear what happened, in his own words. And what he said lined up perfectly with what Baker had already heard from Cass and from the 911 dispatch records. After Mike Sr. finished recounting that horrible morning, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anyone in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he considered the question. He said that, there were a few people in the construction industry that he and his son didn't always see eye to eye with, but for the most part, they tried to maintain good relationships with everyone. Getting into fights was just bad for business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up a bit straighter as if he had just remembered something. He said that actually there was a former coworker who definitely held a grudge against them, his own nephew, Hank Jennings. A few years ago, Hank had gotten angry with them over unpaid overtime wages and had actually filed a lawsuit against the company. They had eventually paid Hank a settlement, but there was still a lot of bad blood between them. Mike Sr. glanced over at his wife, Pat, who just nodded and said the whole ordeal had been extremely stressful and volatile. Baker took down Hank's information, talked with Mike's parents for a few more minutes, and then he and Cass stood up to leave. Baker knew he would need to speak with the Zamitas again, but for now, he decided to give them a break. He and Cass would focus on looking into Hank Jennings. 2 days later, Baker was sitting in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to feel antsy. After his meeting with Mike's parents, he had been hopeful about speaking with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who was also Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to find Hank and bring him in for an interview, they hadn't been able to locate him yet. They had, however, managed to get in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her home in Wakefield. But she hadn't given them much to go on. She said she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she honestly didn't know of anyone who would want to hurt Mike. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements and had found nothing to suggest that anything shady or mafia-related was happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were in a better position than they had been a few days ago. This was mainly because they had finally had a chance to review all of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those cameras had been aimed at the street right outside the company's property. The angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show every vehicle that entered and exited that parking lot from the main street. This particular camera had captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. Then, at 7:44 a.m., just 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck was seen pulling in as well. A few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot, and then, at 7:50 a.m., that same green truck was seen leaving the parking lot just 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02 a.m. So, it seemed very likely that the killer had been driving that green truck and had killed both Mike and Chester in the 6-minute window between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video quality wasn't good enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or to make out its license plate. It also didn't capture the driver getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But just knowing the style and color of what was very likely the killer's vehicle could definitely help them narrow down their list of potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched as Cass picked it up and said hello. A confused look came over Cass's face. He listened for a moment, then thanked the caller and said they would be right over. He hung up the phone and told Baker that that was Michelle Zamiti. She had called to say that she had new information to give them, something she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was very important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. To Baker, Michelle seemed like a completely different person from the last time they had spoken. 2 days ago, she had seemed horrified and overcome with grief. But now, she just seemed incredibly nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented on how many cards there were, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out to send their support, all their friends and neighbors from Wakefield and from Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. Then, Michelle took a deep breath and got straight to the point. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she had been having an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and asked her to continue. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and that she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house. That meant they also spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually, their friendship had blossomed into a romance. Baker could hardly believe what he was hearing. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle a powerful motive to want Mike out of the picture. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle quickly added that her husband had actually known all about her affair. They had been in therapy together and had really started to turn their marriage around. She said that about a month ago, she had officially and completely broken things off with Sean, and she added, Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass. He could tell they were both thinking the same thing. They obviously needed to talk to Sean immediately, but also Michelle was now right back at the top of their suspect list. Maybe she had wanted her husband gone so she could be with Sean. And maybe the only reason she was telling them all of this now was to try to get ahead of the story. But they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So, for now, Baker simply got Sean's phone number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that same night, Baker and Cass were once again in Cass's office. But this time, another officer was with them, there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean Fitzpatrick, the neighbor she'd been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to report on what he had learned. The very first thing Baker wanted to know wasn't about the conversation itself. He just asked, "Did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway?" But the officer shook his head. He said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. He then went on to explain that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he dated a lot of women, but he insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. The officers who were interviewing Sean just let him talk, never revealing that they already knew Michelle had confessed everything to them and that they knew Sean was lying. Baker almost laughed when he heard this. He didn't believe Sean's story for a second. And the fact that he was lying so blatantly made him seem pretty guilty. But before Baker could say so, the officer added one more critical piece of information. He said that Sean actually had a solid alibi. He had been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had confirmed it. This particular neighbor took a walk every morning at 9 a.m., and she had seen Sean outside his house right around that time. Baker sighed in frustration. It took about 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield. That meant Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then make it all the way back to Freedom to be seen by his neighbor at 9 a.m. And just like that, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising lead that had just turned into a dead end. On March 18th, 5 days after the murders of Mike Zamiti and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were at Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators weren't just there to pay their respects. They were also there to finally speak to Hank Jennings, Mike's cousin, who had filed that lawsuit against the company. They still hadn't been able to officially get a hold of him, so Cass had suggested they just corner him at the funeral. He was very likely to attend because, despite the rift with the Zamitis, he was still family. When the service ended and everyone stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right. He pointed out Hank in the crowd. As the attendees began to file out of the church, the two investigators made their way over to Hank and stepped in front of him just before he could get outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's entire body tensed up the moment they blocked his path, like he was about to make a run for it. So, Baker just cut to the chase. He said, "Hank, will you please come with us and answer a few questions?" Hank's eyes went wide. He just said, "No way. Not without my lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried out of the church. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look. They were now both convinced that Hank Jennings was their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves and holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been crudely cut out of a newspaper and pasted onto the page. The message was alarming. Close business now, or more family will die. The note had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said the family had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zamitis, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a grim reminder of their son's murder, but also a direct threat of more violence to come. But for Baker, the note was a lead, and they desperately needed one. It had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and by this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects. And that list now included Hank Jennings. They had learned that Hank's reluctance to speak with them at the funeral wasn't because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of his settlement with the Zamitis, and he was afraid of violating it. When they did finally get him to talk, he had a clear alibi. He was at his job when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own several shotguns, none of them were 1/6 gauge. So Hank joined the growing pile of discarded suspects. This pile included Michelle, who certainly had a motive to kill Mike Jr., but she had been incredibly cooperative, and they hadn't found a single piece of evidence to suggest she was involved, like maybe hiring a hitman. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive, but his alibi had cleared him. There was just no way Sean could have been in Wakefield at the time of the murders because his neighbor had seen him over 100 miles away just an hour later. And so now, this strange, threatening note seemed to point back to the very first theory that Baker and Cass had considered and then ruled out, that the murders were business-related and that the mafia was involved. Cass, being a local, told Baker that a lot of rumors had been swirling around town about the murders. Because of the Zamitis' work on the Big Dig, the general consensus in Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense. But Baker wasn't so sure. They had looked into the Zamitis' books and financial records repeatedly and had found nothing to suggest any shady deals or mob connections. Also, Baker just didn't think this ransom-style note made from newspaper clippings was the mob style. It felt kind of silly and performative. It seemed more like someone was trying to make it look like the mob to lead the investigation down the wrong path. But even if that was the case, this note was still a huge break. Because maybe, just maybe, whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or their DNA on it. So, Baker carefully bagged up the note, and Cass took it to be sent off to the crime lab. Baker knew it would take some time to get the results back, so while they waited, he decided he wanted to re-interview every single suspect and every single witness, just in case they had overlooked something. A few days later, Baker was sitting alone at Cass's desk, reading through another witness statement. He had been re-energized by the new evidence they had gathered and was feeling optimistic about their chances of solving the case. In addition to conducting all the new interviews, they had gotten some forensic results back from that threatening letter. The lab had found both DNA and a clear palm print on it. Now, all they needed was a suspect to compare it to. Just then, the office door flew open and a very excited Detective Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps of Michelle Zamiti's house and knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked for her permission to come inside and retrieve a specific small object from her house. Michelle, who seemed a bit confused by their request, said, "Okay, come on in." The two detectives walked right past her, went straight to the object they were looking for, bagged it as evidence, and walked right back outside. They immediately sent it off to the crime lab. And as soon as the lab results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had finally solved the case. Based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements, Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13th, 2006. At around 7:45 a.m., the killer quietly crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They were carrying a shotgun, and their heart was racing. They were nervous about what they were about to do, but in their mind, Mike Jr. had to go. That was all there was to it. When the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising the shotgun. Mike was sitting in his chair at his desk. When the door opened, he turned to see who it was. As soon as Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at him, his eyes widened in shock. But the killer fired 2 quick blasts before Mike could even move, hitting him in the face and the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his chair and stopped moving. The killer then turned and ran back down the stairs to the garage. But just before they could leave, they froze. They heard the sound of footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. The killer instinctively ducked and hid, not sure what to do, waiting to see if this person would come inside or just leave. A moment later, the door opened and a man, Chester Roberts, stepped inside. The killer leaped out from their hiding spot and shot him once in the back. Chester dropped to the ground, dead. After killing Chester, the killer was in shock. They hadn't planned on killing a second person. Mike was the only target. But they also knew they couldn't just stand around and wait for more people to show up. So, the killer left the building, jumped into the green pickup truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors, and peeled out of the parking lot less than 10 minutes after they had first arrived. As they drove away, they gripped the steering wheel tightly. They knew they should feel guilty for what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was a sense of relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It turns out Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife Michelle, or by his cousin Hank, or by the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle had tried to break things off with Sean, she had told him that the only way she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended the marriage himself, or if something happened to him. Michelle had meant it as a way to let him down easy, but Sean took it as a twisted suggestion. So, he decided to murder Mike Jr. so he could have Michelle all to himself. He stole the green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then drove back. That neighbor who had provided Sean's alibi, the one who said they saw him at his house in Freedom around 9 a.m., had made it seem impossible for Sean to be the killer. But that same neighbor later called the police to amend their statement. They said they had been mistaken and had actually seen Sean later in the day, not at 9 a.m. That single change in their statement created a wide enough window of time on the morning of the murders for it to be absolutely possible for Sean to have driven to Wakefield, committed the murders, and driven back. Once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. They went back to her house to see if Sean had sent one. And he had. When they tested the envelope flap, which he had licked to seal, they got his DNA. They then matched that DNA to the DNA found on the threatening, ransom-style letter that had been sent to the Zamitis, the letter that Sean had created and sent himself in a desperate attempt to throw police off his trail and make them think the mob was involved. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested. He was eventually convicted and received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On an afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed was at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. He took a slow sip of his margarita. Normally, Jack wasn't much of a drinker, but this was a special day, a day for celebrating. It was his daughter Megan's high school graduation party, and for Jack, this was a massive accomplishment, not just for her, but for him too. He had grown up in the foster care system, starting with absolutely nothing. He'd spent his entire adult life working, pushing himself, all to make sure his own kids would have a better, more stable life than he ever did. So, seeing Megan finish school, making good choices, it filled him with an incredible sense of pride. He looked over at a picnic table where Megan was sitting. She was laughing with her brother, Jack Jr., and their mother, Virginia. Even though Jack and Virginia weren't together anymore, they had managed to stay on good terms. It meant a lot to him that the whole family could be there, together, for this moment. But then, as he watched them, Jack's body tensed up. He saw someone else walking across the grass towards their table. It was Megan's boyfriend, Walter. Megan and Walter had recently moved in together, and Jack was not happy about it. He didn't have a personal problem with Walter, not really. The issue was his daughter. Megan was only 18 years old. In Jack's eyes, that was far too young to be living with a boyfriend. But he knew today wasn't the day to make a scene or start a fight. He didn't want to ruin the celebration. So he put on a smile, stood up, and walked over to Walter. To everyone's surprise, he gave him a big, friendly hug and told him he was glad he could make it. They both sat down at the table, joining the rest of the family's conversation. As Jack took another sip of his margarita, he could feel the tension in his shoulders start to release. For now, everything was okay. Later that evening, after the party had wound down, Jack was driving home. He pulled into a gas station along the way, parking his car next to one of the pumps. He went inside the convenience store and handed the cashier a few bills. He was paying for a tank of gas and, as he always did, a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player. He'd never won a big prize, nothing life-changing, but he always held on to that little bit of hope. Maybe one day he'd hit the jackpot and all his financial worries would disappear. He tucked the ticket safely into his pocket, went back outside, and filled up his car. From the gas station, it was just a few more blocks to his home. Jack lived in a trailer that was parked behind a large warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was practical. One of the main reasons he chose this spot was the space. There was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles, including his big red and black dump truck. Over the years, Jack had poured his heart and soul into building his own trucking business from the ground up. He did all sorts of jobs, from garbage removal to moving services. He was making a decent living, but he chose to live frugally. He kept his expenses low, saving every dollar he could for his retirement. His big dream was to save enough money so that in a couple of years, once his son Jack Jr. was done with school, he could finally leave the cold, harsh New Hampshire winters behind. He wanted to move to Las Vegas. The idea had taken root a couple of years earlier when he'd done a moving job for a local guy, a self-made millionaire, who was relocating from New Hampshire to Vegas. Jack saw this man as a huge success story, a symbol of what was possible. He believed that if he just worked hard enough, or maybe, just maybe, got lucky enough with one of those lottery tickets, he could follow that same path to a sunny retirement. Jack got out of his car and walked over to the door of his trailer. He went inside, flicked on the lights, and was about to sit down to take off his shoes when he heard a noise from outside. Immediately, his senses were on high alert. He went to the window, pulled back the curtains, and peered out into the dark woods behind the property. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything more. But his heart was racing. He had to take a few deep breaths just to calm himself down. Almost 2 years before this, there had been an incident. Jack had heard someone creeping around outside his trailer late at night. He'd grabbed his gun and gone out to confront whoever it was. He saw a man standing right at the edge of the woods, just staring at the trailer. The man had looked right at Jack and had even called out his name. Spooked, Jack had fired his gun at the man, who then turned and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. He never came back, and Jack never found out who he was or what he wanted. As far as Jack knew, he didn't have any enemies. The whole encounter made no sense, but it had left him permanently on edge. Ever since that night, any strange noise around his trailer sent a jolt of fear through him. Now, as he stood at the window, he scanned the tree line one more time. Seeing nothing, he finally let the curtain fall back into place. He took the lottery ticket from his pocket, sat down at his small table, and started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. He wasn't a winner this time, but it didn't really affect his mood. He was still riding high from his daughter's party. There was always next time. He was sure his lucky break would come eventually. A couple of weeks went by. On the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into the cab of his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already getting hot outside, and he was on his way to his only job scheduled for the day. It was a simple trash disposal gig, something that would probably only take a few hours. He started the truck's engine, and as he was pulling out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it. The man on the other end said his name was Charlie. He told Jack he'd heard he was the guy to call for hauling stuff away. Charlie explained that he had a new barn that was filled with junk and desperately needed to be cleaned out. He asked if Jack could do the job. Jack said, sure, he could probably get to it that very afternoon. He grabbed his logbook from the passenger seat, flipped to a blank page, and scribbled down the details. He wrote the name Charlie and an address in a town called Deerfield, which was almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he'd give him a call as soon as he was on his way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 o'clock that same afternoon, Jack was driving his dump truck down a secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. The heat was sweltering. He was already exhausted and covered in sweat from the trash disposal job he'd done that morning. He had no idea what to expect from this barn cleaning job or from this guy Charlie. He was just hoping it wouldn't take too long. He wanted to get home. Jack slowed the truck down as he saw a break in the trees to his right, revealing a long gravel driveway. He made the turn. A few seconds later, he pulled up in front of a white 2-story house. Just behind it stood a large barn. Jack parked his dump truck, got out, and walked up to the front door of the house. He took a breath and rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. The first thing Megan noticed was that her dad's big dump truck wasn't parked in its usual spot. That seemed wrong. A knot of anxiety immediately formed in her stomach. About an hour earlier, she had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia. Virginia had told her that Jack hadn't shown up for a job that he had scheduled for that morning. More concerning, he wasn't answering his phone. This was completely out of character for him. Jack was reliable. He never missed a job. Megan told her mom that she and Walter would drive over to his trailer to check on him to make sure everything was okay. Her initial thought was that maybe he'd just overslept or perhaps forgot about the job. But now, seeing that his truck was gone, a different, more worrying possibility emerged. It looked like he had left for work, but for some reason, he never made it to the job site. Still, just to be sure, Megan knocked on the trailer door. She called out for her dad. There was no answer. At this point, Megan pulled out her phone and called her mom back. She told Virginia that her dad wasn't at the trailer and his truck was gone. She admitted that she was starting to feel really worried. A few minutes later, Virginia's car pulled up. The three of them, Megan, Walter, and Virginia, stood there by the empty trailer for the entire afternoon. They kept hoping that at any moment, Jack's dump truck would come rumbling down the road. They called his phone over and over again, but every single time it went straight to voicemail. Finally, around 6:30 in the evening, with still no sign of Jack and no word from him, they knew they had to do something more. They decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, 6 days after Jack's family had reported him missing, a Derry police detective named Mike Hoole pulled his unmarked car into the sprawling parking lot of a Target store. This Target was in Saugus, Massachusetts, a good hour's drive south of Derry. Hoole drove slowly, methodically moving through the rows of parked cars, his eyes scanning for one particular vehicle. He was in charge of Jack Reed's missing persons case, and so far, it had been going nowhere. According to Jack's family, the last time anyone had definitely seen or heard from him was on June 27th, which was 2 days before they even reported him missing. But no one in the family could think of anywhere he might have gone. They couldn't name a single person who might want to hurt him. So, Hoole's initial theory had been a simple one. He figured Jack had probably just decided to drive off for a few days to get some time alone. He assumed he would turn up sooner or later. But that morning, everything had changed. He had gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She told him that the family had been putting up missing person posters all over town. Someone had seen one of the posters and had called her with a tip. This person claimed they had seen Jack's distinctive dump truck parked at this specific target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Jack's home in Derry. The tip was specific enough and strange enough that Hoole decided it was worth the drive to check it out himself. And now, as he made his way towards the back of the massive parking lot, he saw it. Parked near a far corner all by itself was a large red and black dump truck. Hoole stopped his car, got out, and walked over to it. He immediately checked the license plate. It was a match. This was definitely Jack Reed's truck. Hoole peered in through the driver's side window. The cab was empty. But then he noticed something else. There were flies, dozens of them, buzzing around the back of the truck, around the open bed of the dump truck. Whatever was back there, the flies were very interested in it. And then the smell hit him. It was a rotten, awful smell, and it was wafting out from the back of the truck. Hoole pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully climbed up the side of the dump truck to look into the bed. The bed itself was covered by a heavy tarp. He grabbed a corner of the tarp and pulled it back. But he still couldn't see what was underneath. Whatever was in the truck bed was also wrapped tightly in thick layers of plastic sheeting. There was a lot of it. Hoole pulled out a small knife from his pocket and began to carefully cut through the layers of plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack Reed's body into their van. His body was still wrapped in all of that plastic. Hoole desperately wanted to get a look at the body to try and figure out how Jack had died. But that would mean cutting away all the plastic, and he knew he couldn't do that. He had to leave everything intact for the forensics team. It was crucial evidence. So, he would have to wait for the official autopsy to learn the cause of death. But based on what he had seen so far, Hoole was already making some educated guesses. The way Jack's body had been disposed of, wrapped up, and hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his home told him two things. First, this was a murder. Second, it was a carefully planned murder, most likely carried out by someone who knew Jack personally. Hoole had already learned from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women. He knew that family dynamics could be complicated. He figured there could be hidden tensions, old resentments that he didn't know about yet, but he also considered that the murder might be connected to Jack's business. As far as the family knew, Jack's business was completely legitimate. But it was always possible that he had gotten involved with some sketchy people, or maybe he'd done a job that made a client angry, something the family would have no knowledge of. And the act of leaving Jack's body in the back of his own dump truck, that felt symbolic. It felt like someone was trying to send a message. Once the forensics team had finished taking photographs and swabbing the truck for any potential DNA or fingerprints, Hoole pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and opened the driver's side door. He began to search the cab. There was no blood inside, no sign of a weapon, nothing that seemed out of place or immediately helpful to the investigation. That is, until he saw the logbook. It was tucked into a storage pocket on the passenger side door. He reached over, pulled it out, and started to flip through the pages. Inside was a list of all of Jack's recent appointments, complete with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of his clients. The last recorded job in the book was for the morning of June 27th, back in Derry, where Jack lived. There were no other jobs written down for that day. But then, a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hoole found another entry. It looked like it had been scribbled down in a hurry. It was just an address, 145 North Road. There was no town listed, and the client's name was just one word, Charlie. Hool carefully placed the logbook into an evidence bag and sealed it. As he stood up, he looked around the parking lot. He noticed the security cameras mounted on the light posts all over the lot, and he saw that one of them was pointing directly at the spot where Jack's truck had been parked. The next day, Wednesday, July 6th, Detective Hool was back at the precinct in Derry. He was sitting at his desk, reading over the autopsy report that had just come in from the Massachusetts Medical Examiner's Office. The report described a brutal attack. Jack had been severely beaten. He had multiple broken ribs, several skull fractures, and a hole in the side of his head that the report described as being the size of a softball. His face had been so badly damaged that the medical examiner had needed to use Jack's dental records to officially confirm his identity. Hool thought about the level of violence. It was extreme. It felt personal. This only reinforced his belief that Jack's killer, or killers, had to be someone who knew him. Just then, there was a knock at his door. An officer peeked his head into Hool's office and asked him to come and take a look at something. Hool stood up from his desk and followed the officer down the hallway to another room. Inside, a team of investigators was gathered around a monitor going over the security footage from the target parking lot. Hool watched over their shoulders as they pulled up a specific clip. He could see the timestamp in the corner of the screen. The footage was from around 5:30 in the evening on June 27th. That was the same day as the last job written in Jack's logbook. An investigator nodded at Hool, and then he pressed play. The grainy footage showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot. It was being followed closely by a white minivan. After the dump truck parked, two people got out. Unfortunately, the quality of the video was poor. It was impossible to make out any real details about these two individuals. Hool couldn't even tell if they were men or women. It was just two blurry figures. But what they were doing was clear enough. They were dumping Jack's body. One of them walked around to the back of the dump truck and appeared to check that the tarp was secure. Then, both of them walked over to the white minivan, got inside, and the minivan drove away. Hool's mind was racing. This footage suggested there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people who got out of the truck, and then there had to be a third person driving the white minivan. But another frustrating reality was that the footage was so fuzzy, they couldn't get a license plate number from the minivan. It was a dead end. But then, the investigator told Hool there was something else he needed to see. He pulled up another segment of video. This one was from the evening of July 4th. That was 7 days after Jack's truck had been abandoned in the parking lot, and just 1 day before Hool himself had found it. The investigator explained that this footage was from a different security camera, one that was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. He hit play. He directed Hool's attention to a particular car that was pulling into the lot. The angle on this car was much better, much closer. There was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. As Hool watched, he saw a young woman get out of the passenger seat and start walking toward the entrance of the store. Hool leaned in closer to the screen, squinting. And then he realized he recognized the woman. It was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that same day, Detective Hool walked into an interrogation room at the Derry police station. Megan was sitting at the table, waiting for him. When Hool entered, he made a point to be friendly. He shook her hand and gave her a sympathetic smile. He didn't want to tip his hand to let on that she was now a suspect. So, he didn't mention the security video. He didn't tell her they had footage of her in the exact same parking lot where her father's body was found just 1 day before the discovery. But as they started talking, Megan brought it up herself. She said she had been shocked when she found out that her father had been found dead, of course, but also that his body had been dumped in that specific Target parking lot. She explained that she had just been there recently. She told Hool that her boyfriend, Walter's sister, lived in Saugus, and they had gone to visit her for the 4th of July. She said they were trying to get their minds off her father's disappearance, since at that point, he was still just a missing person. Megan said that they had made a last-minute decision to spend the night. Because it was unexpected, they had to drive to the nearest Target to buy a contact lens case. As she told the story, she shook her head and said she couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe her dad's body had been right there in that same lot. She had been so close to him and had no idea. Hool had to admit the story didn't sound completely impossible. And in the security video, Megan hadn't gone anywhere near the part of the parking lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a very hard time believing this was all just a massive coincidence. His suspicion grew even stronger when he went back and reviewed the statement Megan had given to the police when she first reported her father missing. In that initial report, she had said that the last time she saw her dad was on the night of Monday, June 27th. She and Walter had supposedly gone to his trailer to pick up an air conditioner, but now Hool knew that was impossible. The time-stamped security video proved that by the evening of June 27th, Jack was already dead, his body already dumped in that Target parking lot. So, during this new interview with Megan, Hool asked her again, "When was the last time you saw your father?" And once again, without even a moment's hesitation, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hool pressed her. He asked if she was absolutely positive about that date. And she said, yes, absolutely. Without letting on that he was now certain Megan was lying, Hool ended the interview and let her go. He immediately called in her boyfriend, Walter, who had been waiting out in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who had driven her to that Target in Saugus. Hool wanted to question them separately to see if their stories would match up or if he could find any contradictions. But when he spoke to Walter, he got the exact same story. Walter repeated everything Megan had said about why they were in the area, why they went to that specific Target, right down to the detail about needing a contact lens case. Walter also confirmed that the last time they had seen Jack was on the night of the 27th. Their stories were identical. But to Detective Hool, that consistency didn't prove their innocence. It did the opposite. It convinced him that Megan and Walter had carefully rehearsed this story. It was their alibi. The only problem for them was they had no idea that time-stamped security footage existed that would completely shatter it. The following afternoon, Hool was at his desk combing through a copy of Jack Reed's phone records. He had sent other officers out that morning to interview Megan's family and friends. He was looking for anything that could help him build a case against her. They quickly learned that Megan and Walter had recently moved in together and that Jack had not approved of the arrangement. This gave Hool a potential motive. He started to wonder if maybe the young couple had killed Jack just to get him out of their lives, to stop him from interfering. At some point, Megan must have found out from her friends that the police were investigating her. She called Hool's office to revise her testimony. She now claimed that she had made a mistake. She said the last time she saw her dad was actually on the night of Sunday the 26th, not Monday the 27th. But Hool didn't buy it. He didn't believe that both she and Walter had made the exact same mistake about the date. They had both been so confident when they said the 27th. Hool was convinced that if he could just meticulously retrace Jack's steps on the day he died, he would find some concrete proof that Megan and Walter were involved. He had already checked on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, the one from the morning of June 27th. The client had confirmed that Jack was there and completed the job. Security footage from the local dump even showed Jack's truck dropping off the trash from that job at around 2 in the afternoon. But that still left a gap of about 3 hours on the afternoon of June 27th, where Jack's whereabouts were a mystery. And Hool knew that Jack had to have been killed sometime within that 3-hour window. So now he hoped that Jack's phone records might hold the key. They might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hool had been able to match most of the phone numbers from Jack's call log to contacts that were already in his logbook, all except for one. On the morning of June 27th, Jack had received a call from a number that wasn't saved anywhere in his contacts. Then, at 2:07 that afternoon, right around the time he was finishing up at the dump, and just a few hours before his body would be left in that Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that very same number. Hoole tried calling the number himself, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. So, he contacted the cell phone provider and asked them to look up who the number belonged to. They told him it was registered to a man named Charlie W. Suddenly, something clicked in Hoole's mind. He reached over and grabbed Jack's logbook from the evidence bag on his desk. He flipped to that last, hastily scribbled entry, the address, 145 North Road, and the name, Charlie. This had to be the same Charlie who had called from that mysterious number. And it meant this Charlie might have been the last person to see Jack Reed alive. Or, more likely, Charlie was the person who had killed him. The employee from the cell phone company also told Hoole that the number was from a prepaid phone. It was the kind you could buy at a convenience store and add minutes to without ever signing a contract or providing real identification. The phone had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hoole asked the worker to send over a complete copy of the call records for that prepaid phone. After he hung up, Hoole logged on to the police database and searched for the name Charlie W. He found nothing. No criminal records, no driver's licenses, no car registrations. Hoole was now almost certain that Charlie W. was a fake name. And what seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up the address from the logbook, 145 North Road. There was no one named Charlie affiliated with that property. The registered owner of 145 North Road was a man named Michael Connors. The name didn't mean anything to Hoole. It certainly wasn't Charlie. Hoole stood up from his desk and grabbed his car keys. It was time to pay a visit to 145 North Road and talk to whoever was actually living there. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole turned his car onto a long gravel driveway at 145 North Road. This was the address from Jack Reed's logbook, a secluded farm. He parked his car, walked up to the large white house, and rang the doorbell. The middle-aged man who answered the door seemed perfectly calm and composed at first. But the moment Hoole showed him his police badge, the man's demeanor changed completely. He started acting incredibly jumpy and nervous. Standing in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors. The man nodded and said yes. Hoole then asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed. Michael Connors quickly shook his head and said no. When Hoole asked him why his address was written in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered and said he had no idea. It was obvious to Hoole that Michael was hiding something. He clearly knew more than he was letting on. So Hoole asked Michael where he had been on the afternoon of June 27th. Michael, looking even more nervous, quickly replied that he had spent the entire day doing repair work at a friend's lake house, which was 30 miles away. He said he didn't get home until late that night. He then gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on the same job, men who could supposedly verify his alibi. Hoole, trying not to show how suspicious he was, wrote down the names and contact information. Then, as calmly as he could, he asked Michael if he could take a look around the property, both inside the house and outside. Michael looked defeated. He nodded and said yes, then stepped aside to let Hoole in. The detective walked into the house and went from room to room. He didn't see any signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing that looked obviously suspicious. He then went back outside and followed a muddy path that led over to the barn, which was a short distance from the main house. He pulled open the heavy wooden door, and sunlight flooded the interior. Hoole stepped inside. The first thing that struck him was how incredibly neat and clean it was. He started looking behind stacks of hay bales, he shined his flashlight into all the dark corners, he bent down to examine the dirt and straw covering the floor. But the barn was spotless. It was almost as if it had been recently and very, very thoroughly cleaned. When Hoole was finished in the barn, he walked back towards the house. As he did, he saw Michael Connors standing by the back door, just staring at him. It was clear he had been watching Hoole's every move over at the barn. Hool walked up to Michael and, in that same calm voice, asked him one last question. He asked if he knew anyone named Megan Reed. Michael said no, but the way he said it was different. It was less anxious. For the first time, Hool felt like Michael was actually telling the truth. After that, Hool walked back to his car. As he drove away, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at the farm, Michael Connors' bizarre behavior was screaming guilt. Later that day, Hool hung up the phone in his office, feeling deeply frustrated. He had called every single one of the contractors whose names Michael Connors had given him, and every single one of them had confirmed his alibi. Michael had, in fact, been doing repairs at his friend's house 30 miles away at the time of Jack's death. So, Hool figured Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder. But his suspicious behavior still suggested that he probably knew something had happened on his property while he was away. This gave Hool a new angle to work with. It could mean that at least one of Jack's killers was close enough to Michael that Michael was willing to lie and obstruct a police investigation to protect them. But that was all he had. There was no obvious link between this Michael Connors and his primary suspects, Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter. He was starting to think that maybe he had been looking in the wrong direction all along, that perhaps Megan and Walter weren't involved after all. It was still early in the investigation. There were plenty of other potential suspects to look into, like Jack's ex-partners, his adult children from his first relationship, and all the other clients listed in his logbook. But just then, Hool's old fax machine whirred to life. The cell phone provider was finally sending over the complete call records from that mysterious prepaid Charlie phone. Once the sheet finished printing, Hool ripped it out of the machine and began to look it over. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, with one single exception. There was one other number in the call log. And when Detective Hool looked into the owner of that one other number, the entire case finally began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on the 27th of June, 2005. That afternoon, as Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, two of his killers were inside the house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their foot on the floor. The other, their accomplice, stared at them with an annoyed look, a silent command to stop. And they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the two killers went to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed put on the couch. The nervous one listened as the door opened. They heard the sound of their accomplice's voice greeting Jack. A few seconds later, Jack himself walked into the living room. The nervous killer, seeing Jack in person, jumped to their feet, trying to act natural, but they were likely radiating anxiety. After a short, probably awkward conversation between the three of them, they all left the house and started walking down the dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the nervous killer deliberately hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. As they got closer to the barn, their heart began to pound in their chest. They had rehearsed this plan a dozen times. They knew exactly what they were supposed to do. But now that the moment was here, actually doing it felt terrifyingly real. Then, the heavy doors to the barn were pulled open. Inside, Jack would have seen two more people waiting for him in the shadows. But before he even had a chance to react, the nervous killer who was behind him lunged forward, tackling Jack and sending him crashing to the ground. A split second later, the nervous killer heard a loud, sickening thump. They looked up and saw one of their accomplices standing over them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer scrambled to their feet and looked down at Jack. He was lying on the floor of the barn, a gaping, gruesome hole in the side of his skull. The sight was so horrific that the nervous killer had to run outside and vomit. When they came back inside, the other three killers had unrolled a large sheet of plastic on the barn floor. They were in the process of moving Jack's body into the center of it. Blood was still pouring from his head wound, forming a big red puddle on the plastic. It was a horrific scene. Then, one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, the bleeding would stop. And so, they raised the hammer and began pounding it onto Jack's chest. After a few brutal blows, the bleeding did slow down. And then, the four killers worked together, wrapping Jack's body tightly in the plastic sheeting. Once he was completely wrapped up, they carried his body outside and loaded it into the back of his own dump truck. The killer, who had first answered the door, the calmer of the two, got into the driver's seat of the truck. The nervous killer, the one who had tackled Jack, climbed into the passenger seat. The other two, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, got into a white minivan. They followed the dump truck as it drove away from the farm all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally arrived in Saugus, they pulled into the first large parking lot they saw, the one belonging to the Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot. When they got out, the nervous killer did one last check on the tarp to make sure it was secure. Then, they and their calmer accomplice walked across the asphalt to the white minivan and climbed inside. After that, all four killers drove all the way back to the farm in New Hampshire. They had one last job to do: clean up the barn. The farm's owner, Michael Connors, had been very clear that he expected the property to be left in perfect condition. Michael Connors was not directly involved in the murder itself. However, he did know that the mastermind of the plot was going to be using his property that day while he was gone. He would later testify that he did not know the specific details of their plan, only that they needed to use the barn, and he had asked them to clean up after themselves. The reason he allowed his property to be used at all was because he was doing a favor for the mastermind of the murder. That mastermind was his longtime friend and business partner. He was also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed had so admired, the man whose successful life Jack had hoped to one day emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks. And he believed, without any real evidence, that when Jack Reed had helped him move a few years prior, Jack had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. Brooks was convinced of this, and he held a bitter grudge. In retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son Jesse to Jack's home to try and scare him. That was the prowler Jack had seen in the middle of the night, the man who had called out his name from the edge of the woods. But when Jack came out with a gun and actually fired at Jesse, it didn't scare John Brooks off. It did the opposite. It made him even angrier. He vowed to get his revenge. So, he orchestrated a plot sending 4 people to New Hampshire with the sole purpose of killing Jack Reed. Those 4 people were his son, Jesse Brooks, Jesse's friend, Michael Benton, who was not the same Michael who owned the farm, and 2 other men named Joseph Vroomman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually arrested and convicted for their roles in Jack Reed's murder. John Brooks, the mastermind, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life. Michael Benton received a sentence of 33 years to life. Joseph Vroomman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years. And John Brooks' son, Jesse Brooks, was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In March of 2015, a 8-year-old woman named Tamara Samsonova was living in her small apartment in St. Petersburg, Russia. The building was old, and her home was in a state of disrepair, so she had finally saved up enough money to have some major renovations done. Workers were coming in to tear down walls and redo the plumbing. It was going to be loud, dusty, and generally unlivable for a few weeks. Tamara didn't really have anywhere else to go. Her family was either distant or had passed on, and she lived a fairly solitary life. But she had a friend, a kind woman who lived nearby. Her name was Valentina Olenova, and she was 79 years old. Valentina had heard all about Tamra's upcoming home improvement project and the chaos it was going to cause. So she reached out to her friend. She called Tamra and simply said, "You can't stay there while all that is going on. Why don't you come and stay with me until it's done?" Tamra was incredibly grateful for the offer. It was a huge relief. She immediately accepted, thanking Valentina over and over again. As soon as the work began on her own apartment, Tamra packed a small bag and moved into Valentina's home. From the moment she arrived, she was determined not to be a burden. Valentina was older, and Tamara knew she couldn't afford to pay any rent, so she decided she would earn her keep in other ways. She immediately started taking over the household chores. She would wake up early and clean the entire apartment from top to bottom. She scrubbed the floors, dusted the furniture, and made sure the kitchen was always spotless. After Valentina finished a meal, Tamara would insist on clearing the table and washing all the dishes by hand. She also took it upon herself to do all the cooking. She wanted her friend to feel looked after, to show her just how much she appreciated the generosity. A couple of weeks went by just like this. The arrangement seemed to be working out well. The renovations on Tamara's apartment were eventually completed. The workers packed up their tools, the dust settled, and her home was finally ready for her to move back in. But a strange thing happened. Tamra didn't want to leave. She had grown comfortable living with Valentina. She enjoyed the company and the routine they had settled into. It was nice not to be alone. So she approached Valentina with a new request. She asked, would it be okay if I stayed just a little bit longer? Valentina seemed a bit hesitant at first. The initial offer had been for a specific period, just until the renovations were done. But she was a kind woman, and she could see that Tamra was enjoying her time there. So, after a moment, she agreed. Okay, that's fine, she said. But a little bit longer turned into a lot longer. Weeks turned into months. Spring turned into summer. And Tamra showed absolutely no signs of leaving. She had completely settled in, as if Valentina's apartment was now her own. Valentina, meanwhile, was growing more and more frustrated. Her small apartment, which had once been her quiet sanctuary, now felt crowded. She was starting to feel like a guest in her own home. The initial gratitude and helpfulness from Tamra had started to feel like a permanent fixture she hadn't signed up for. The tension in the apartment grew thicker with each passing day. Finally, in late July of 2015, Valentina couldn't take it anymore. She decided she had to confront Tamara directly. She sat her down and told her, plainly and simply, "You have to go. Your apartment is ready. It's time for you to move back home." But Tamara's response was shocking. She just looked at Valentina and said, "No, I'm not leaving." This sparked a huge fight. Voices were raised, and years of friendship seemed to evaporate in a matter of minutes. Valentina insisted that she leave, and Tamara stubbornly refused. But at the end of the argument, nothing was resolved. Tamara was still there. She did not pack her bags. She did not leave. For the next couple of days, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. The two women moved around each other like ghosts, completely avoiding eye contact and not speaking a single word. The air was thick with resentment. This Cold War was finally broken on July 23rd. The trigger was something incredibly trivial. There were a few unwashed cups left in the kitchen sink. One of them was supposed to have cleaned them, but hadn't. An argument erupted over whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. That small disagreement quickly spiraled, and of course, it led right back to the main issue. Valentina's frustration boiled over. "You shouldn't even be here to use my cups," she yelled. "You need to leave my home." Tamara fired back. "No, I'm not going to leave." Another huge blowout fight happened right there in the kitchen. But this time, something was different. At the end of all the shouting, Tamara's demeanor suddenly changed. She seemed to finally concede. She looked at Valentina and said, "Okay, I get it. You're right. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days to get my things together, and I'll be out of your hair. Instantly, the tension in the room vanished. The fighting stopped. Valentina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she was going to get her apartment back. The conflict was over. To smooth things over, Tamara offered a peace treaty of sorts. "Look," she said, "I'll make us dinner tonight. I'll go out and get some food." Tamara left the apartment a short time later. But she didn't go straight to the grocery store. Her first stop was a local pharmacy. Inside, she purchased a large quantity of potent sleeping pills. After that, she went to the market and bought all the ingredients for Olivier salad, a traditional Russian dish that she knew was one of Valentina's absolute favorites. She then returned to the apartment and went into the kitchen. She started preparing dinner, chopping vegetables for the salad. As she worked, she took the sleeping pills she had just bought. She carefully crushed dozens of them into a fine white powder. Then she mixed that powder thoroughly into the mayonnaise-based salad dressing. She made sure it was completely dissolved, completely unnoticeable. She served the salad to Valentina, who was hungry and glad that the fighting had stopped. Valentina ate the entire portion, not noticing anything unusual about the taste or texture. As soon as Tamara was certain that Valentina had eaten the whole salad, she cleaned up the dinner plates, said goodnight, and went up to her room. She got into bed and waited. A couple of hours passed. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Tamara quietly got out of bed and crept downstairs to the kitchen. There, she saw Valentina passed out on the floor. Tamara knelt down beside her friend's motionless body. She checked for a pulse and saw that Valentina was still breathing. A flicker of disappointment crossed Tamara's face. She had hoped the massive overdose of sleeping pills would be enough to kill her. But it didn't matter. The plan would proceed anyway. From a hiding spot, Tamara retrieved a hacksaw. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that day, making up some excuse about needing to do a small repair. Now, in the dead of night, she stood over her unconscious friend and began the gruesome task of butchering her body. She was methodical and precise. As she cut Valentina into pieces, she took special care with one particular part of the body. She carefully removed the lungs, making sure not to damage them. It turns out, human lungs were Tamara's favorite food. She took Valentina's head and placed it into a large pot of water on the stove and began to boil it. The rest of the body was dismembered into the smallest pieces she could manage. She wrapped the pieces in an old shower curtain and then placed them into various plastic bags. While the head and lungs cooked on the stovetop, Tamara began the long process of disposing of the evidence. She made dozens of trips, carrying the heavy bags from the apartment, down the stairs, and out the front door. She walked all the way to a small lake that was near their property. Under the cover of darkness, she threw the bags into the water one by one before returning to the apartment to get more. Some of the larger parts, like Valentina's hips and legs, were apparently too heavy for her to carry all the way to the lake. So, for those, she took a different route, dragging them to a nearby patch of forest and leaving them there. Tamara's final trip was the most surreal. She carried a big silver cooking pot out of the building. Inside of it was what was left of Valentina's head after Tamara had finished eating most of it. 4 days passed. On July 27th, a young couple who lived in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for an evening walk with their dog near the lake. As they strolled along the path, their dog suddenly took off running. It stopped in front of a large, bulky bag that had washed up near the shore. The dog started sniffing it intensely, pawing at it and trying to get it open. The couple called for their dog to come back, but it wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated on the bag. Curious, the owners walked over to see what had captured their dog's attention. They poked the bag with their foot and could tell it was very heavy. Hesitantly, they managed to pry it open. Inside, they found a human torso. It was Valentina's. When the police arrived, their first stop was Valentina Olenova's apartment. They knocked on the door, and to their surprise, it was opened by Tamara. They were very sensitive with her at first. They explained that her friend, her roommate, had been found deceased and that they needed to search the apartment as part of the investigation. Tamara's reaction was chilling. She was completely indifferent. She showed no emotion, no sadness, no shock. It was as if she had been expecting this day to come. She just stepped aside and let them in without any protest. During the search, it didn't take long for the officers to find evidence. There were traces of blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They found the hacksaw she had used still stained with blood. And then they found Tamara's personal diary. It was sitting on a small table next to a book about black magic and the occult. The police began to read the diary, and they were horrified by what they found. It contained meticulous handwritten notes detailing the ritualistic killings she had committed over the past 20 years. There were 14 of them in total. The diary entries revealed that almost all of the murders were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells she was learning about from her black magic books. Apparently, many of these spells required human flesh or other human body parts as components, so she would kill these people, use their bodies for her rituals, and then, afterwards, she would consume them. This part, the cannibalism, had nothing to do with the spells. She did it simply because she liked the taste of people with a particular fondness for human lungs. The police arrested Tamara on the spot. She didn't put up a fight. She calmly admitted to everything. "Yep, you got the right person," she said. "I did all of this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed to be in a great mood, almost euphoric. She was seen smiling and blowing kisses to the reporters in the courtroom. It was a bizarre spectacle. At one point, she addressed the judge directly, saying, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." It was like she was completely out of touch with reality, or perhaps she just knew her life as a free person was over, and she simply didn't care anymore. Tamara, who was quickly nicknamed the Granny Ripper by the newspapers, was found guilty and given a life sentence. To this day, she remains in prison. Surveillance footage was later released showing an elderly woman identified as Tamara carrying heavy black bags out of her apartment building in the middle of the night, and other shots showed her bizarre, cheerful demeanor during her trial. Sometimes a person's intuition can save them from a terrible fate, even when they don't know why. There was a man who, after spending 21 years in the U.S. Army, retired and moved to a quiet part of Central Florida with his wife and young son. He had a military pension coming in, and his wife still worked a full-time job, so they were financially comfortable. But after a few months of retirement, he found himself getting incredibly bored. He was used to being active, to having a purpose every day. And so, he decided to get a simple, low-stress job just to stay occupied. He ended up taking a position as a night clerk at a gas station on the highway. One of the main reasons he chose this particular job was because the owners were very laid back. They didn't mind if he had company, so he could bring his son along with him to hang out during his shifts. For years, that's just how it went. The man would work his shifts at the gas station, and his son would tag along. Even as the son grew into a teenager, when you'd think he'd want to be doing other things with his friends, he still came to the gas station. The town they lived in was so small and remote that there was almost nothing else for a teenager to do. So he continued to spend his evenings at the gas station with his dad well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, the son, who was 15 years old at the time, was taking a break. He was sitting outside at a picnic table under the bright fluorescent lights of the gas station canopy. He was reading a magazine and sipping on a Mountain Dew. It was dark out and very quiet. There were no cars at the pumps, no customers inside, and hardly any traffic on the highway. It was in this quiet that he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A woman was walking off the highway, heading directly towards the gas station. This immediately struck him as odd. He thought to himself, "No one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here." His immediate assumption was that her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their phone to call for a tow truck or a ride. The woman continued walking across the large empty parking lot, getting closer and closer. The boy had turned his attention back to his magazine, but he later said he kept looking up, keeping an eye on her. There was just something about her that felt a little off, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The woman walked right past the picnic table where he was sitting. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't say hello, just walked straight through the glass doors and into the gas station. She began to walk up and down the aisles. From where the boy was sitting, he had a clear view inside. He could see his father standing behind the counter, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she moved between the shelves. As soon as the woman was inside, pacing the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and just watched. He noticed that she wasn't really shopping. She would glance down at the items on a shelf for a few seconds, but she never picked anything up. She didn't seem interested in buying anything. Every few moments, she would look up towards the counter where his father was and just stare at him. Then she'd look back down and continue her slow walk through the store. After a few minutes of this, the woman seemed to abandon the pretense of shopping and just walked directly up to the counter. There was nobody else in the store, and with the door propped open for the warm night air, the boy could hear their conversation fairly clearly. The woman told his father that her car had broken down and she needed a ride. She asked if he could please drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of their location. The boy would later say that his father's reaction was very strange. Normally, his dad was incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He was a chatty, friendly guy who would talk to anyone who came into the store. But with this woman, his dad's tone was dismissive, almost rude. When she asked for a ride, he just said flatly, "No, I won't give you a ride." The woman was clearly annoyed by how quickly he had shut her down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turned and looked through the glass at the boy sitting outside on the bench. He was looking right at her. She pointed a finger at him and said to his father, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy saw his father, who was out of the woman's direct line of sight, look at him and shake his head firmly. The message was clear. No. Whatever she wants from you, you're going to say no to it. The boy was a bit confused by all this. He was still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman. She seemed like she was in trouble and needed help. But he trusted his father's judgment. He knew that if the woman came outside and asked him directly, he would follow his dad's silent instruction and say no. But it never came to that. The boy's father said to the woman in a firm voice, "No, my son's not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you." The woman was furious. She started cussing at his father, then stormed out of the gas station, slamming the door behind her. As she walked away, she started cussing at the boy too. She walked back towards the highway, turning around every few feet to flip them off and scream profanities at them. The dad came out and stood next to his son, watching her until she disappeared into the darkness. The boy turned to his dad and asked, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why didn't you want to help her? And his dad just shook his head and said, I don't know. There was just something off about her. I can't explain it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I just knew she had to go. A year went by. One evening, the boy was in his room at home when he heard his dad yelling from the other room, "Come in here! Come look at the TV! Quick!" He ran into the living room, and on the television screen was a news report. And on the screen was the face of the same woman from the gas station. Her name, the news anchor said, was Aileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who had been terrorizing Central Florida, picking up her male victims at gas stations along the highway. It's unclear if the boy or his father were intended to be her next victims that night. But by the time she had shown up at their gas station, she had already murdered 4 men. And following her interaction with them, she had gone on to kill 3 more, including a man in Ocala, Florida, the very town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Aileen had finally been caught, which is why she was on the news. She was later tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The boy and his father just stood there, staring at the screen, realizing how close they had come to a monster that night, and how a father's unexplainable gut feeling had saved both of their lives. In the early evening of the 7th of May, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zvonka Telemakowska was in the kitchen of her apartment in the small southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kichevo is a quiet, remote place nestled at the base of a huge mountain in northern Macedonia. It's a beautiful town, but very little of note ever happens there. Zvonka made her living as a cleaning lady. She worked hard cleaning houses for wealthier families in the area. But on this particular day, she had the day off. So she was just relaxing at home, waiting for her adult son, Zoran, to come home so they could have dinner together. It was a beautiful, warm spring evening, and Zvonka had the kitchen windows open as she moved about, preparing herself a small snack. At some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. She picked it up and answered. It was one of her friends on the other line, but her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and panicked. Her friend asked Zvonka if she was paying attention to the news, if she had the radio or the television on. Zvonka said, "No, why?" "What's wrong?" Her friend then told her that there was a breaking news story all over the local channels. There had been a huge, terrible traffic accident right there in their town. And then the friend delivered the devastating news. Zvonka's son Zoran, the son she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in that accident. Zvonka let out a strangled cry. She dropped the food she was preparing onto the counter and, without a second's hesitation, turned and ran out the front door of her apartment. As she burst outside, her neighbor, who happened to be standing outside their own apartment, saw her and called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Zvonka, who was already running down the walkway towards the road, just blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and that she was going to the hospital. The neighbor watched as Zvonka continued to run, not slowing down, until she turned a corner at the end of the street and disappeared from sight. Zvonka didn't own a car, so she was literally running to the hospital to get to her son. A little while later, that same neighbor who had watched Zvonka run off heard a knock on their door. The neighbor went to the door and opened it. They were completely shocked by who they saw standing on the doorstep. It was Zvonka's son, Zoran, and he didn't appear to be hurt in any way at all. Before the neighbor could even ask what was going on, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, spoke first. "Hey," he said, "have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going." The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, trying to process this bizarre situation. Then the neighbor said, "Wait a minute, Zoran, weren't you in a car accident?" Zoran looked even more confused. "No," he said, "what are you talking about?" The neighbor then explained what had happened just a short time earlier, how they had seen his mother run out of her apartment in a panic, saying that her son had been in an accident and that she was running to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was. He immediately pulled out his phone and called the local hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital staff answered, they told Zoran two things. First, his mother was not there. She hadn't been there all day. And second, while they had also heard some vague reports about a car accident in town, there had been no accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. By the end of the night, Zoran had no idea where his mother was or what was going on with this strange car accident story. He did the only thing he could think of. He went to the police and reported his mother, Zvonka, missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, Zvonka was still missing. The police had no new leads, no suspects, nothing. It was as if she had just vanished into thin air. On that day, a 5-6-year-old local reporter named Vlado Taneski, who happened to live not far from Zvonka, received a phone call. It was one of his confidential sources inside the police department. The source told him that Zvonka had just been found. This information was not yet public. And unfortunately, Zvonka was dead. Her body, which had been brutally beaten, strangled, and stabbed, had been found wrapped in plastic sheets and dumped in an illegal trash heap not far from the town's football stadium. The source also told Vlado that when her body was searched, she still had her wallet and jewelry on her, This seemed to rule out the possibility that it was a robbery gone wrong. However, when police did their initial background check on Zvonka, they found she was just a poor elderly cleaning lady. She had no known enemies, no criminal connections, no secret life. It made no sense that she would be the victim of such a brutal and personal murder, one that clearly wasn't motivated by money. Vlado thanked his source for the information and hung up the phone. His source had sounded genuinely shocked and disturbed by the murder, but Vlado felt something different. He wasn't just shocked, he was suspicious. He felt like something about this case was just off. On the surface, Zvonka appeared to be this simple, harmless woman. But maybe that wasn't the whole story. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see. Vlado didn't know for sure, but his journalist's instincts were telling him there was a much bigger story here and it needed to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in Kisevo for being an aggressive and fearless journalist. He wasn't afraid to dive headfirst into murky stories involving corruption or abuse of power. He would dig and dig until he got to the bottom of things, and then he would publish articles that were highly critical of the government, the police, or anyone else in a position of authority. As a result of this approach, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many times for things he had written or was investigating. But even though he knew that digging into Zvonka's murder could once again put him in a dangerous position, he felt it was his responsibility as a journalist to pursue the truth. Feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, walked out the front door of his house, and made the short walk over to Zvonka's apartment building. When he got there, her son, Zoran, answered the door. A few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting together in Zvonka's kitchen, and Zoran was telling him everything that had happened. He recounted how he had come home for dinner only to find his mom wasn't there. He told Vlado about the conversation with the neighbor and the bizarre, non-existent car accident that had sent his mother running into the night. As Zoran spoke, Vlado took meticulous notes, asking lots of follow-up questions. By the end of the interview, when Vlado felt he had learned everything there was to know about Zvonka, he believed he had a pretty good working theory as to what had really happened to her. And the key to his theory was something Zoran had told him about his mother's profession. She was a cleaning lady. It took Vlado a couple of days to put his story together. He went out and interviewed dozens more people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19th, just 3 days after Zvonka's body was found, Vlado published his story in the national newspaper. The headline was "Explosive: A Serial Killer Stalks Kisevo." In the article, Vlado argued that Zvonka's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, he claimed her murder was linked to 2 other unsolved murders of 2 other women in their town. And these 2 other victims, he pointed out, were strikingly similar to Zvonka. They were also poor, older women who worked as cleaning ladies. When Vlado had been talking to Zoran, and Zoran described his mother's life and work, Vlado's mind had clicked, remembering these other cold cases. The other 2 victims were 6-4-year-old Mitra Simjanowska, who was murdered in 2005, and 5-6-year-old Yubika Likoska, who was murdered in 2007. Vlado's story was a bombshell. He was telling the public that a serial killer was on the loose in their quiet little town. But the story was also highly explosive for another reason. Vlado used the article to speak very critically about the police. He specifically pointed out that the murders in 2005 and 2007 had been totally mishandled. An arrest had even been made in one of those cases, but Vlado argued that the police had clearly arrested an innocent person because now there was a third victim. In Vlado's opinion, the police had completely dropped the ball. When the police read Vlado's story, they were furious with him for his criticism. However, they also had to admit that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from his interviews with people in the community. The connections he drew between the 3 victims did seem to paint a credible picture of a potential serial killer. And so, based almost entirely on Vlado's article, The police officially linked all three murders and began a new investigation into a possible serial killer operating in their midst. But at the same time they started this new investigation, Vlado began to notice something strange. He was being followed by police all the time. He would be out in town, doing his job, interviewing people, and he would see a police officer standing somewhere in the distance, just watching him. But Vlado had expected some kind of blowback from the police for his article. He just assumed they were trying to intimidate him, to watch him. He decided to ignore it and continue doing his job. By early June, about 2 weeks after Zvonka had been found, the police's new serial killer investigation had managed to narrow down a suspect pool of hundreds of people to just 3 individuals. They felt they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, Vlado was still being tailed by police, and the police had not yet made any public statements about the case. But on that day, Vlado's editor at the newspaper received a call from a police officer. The officer told the editor that they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. As soon as the call ended, the editor tried to phone Vlado to give him the breaking news. But Vlado didn't pick up his phone, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. The editor also thought it was strange that the police officer had called him, the editor, and not Vlado, the journalist who had broken the story wide open. Why not go to the guy who was covering the case? The editor tried calling Vlado several more times, but he never answered. The editor just figured Vlado must be busy interviewing someone, or maybe he had already found out about the imminent arrest and was on the scene, ready to report on it. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kisevo, police had surrounded a modest 2-story home. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and tall fir trees shrouded the house, which had heavy drapes covering all the windows. Once the police had the house completely surrounded, a team of officers walked up to the front porch. They knocked loudly on the door and yelled for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was just tense silence. Then, the officers on the porch heard footsteps moving inside the house. They raised their weapons, ready for anything. The door slowly creaked open, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He seemed unthreatening, even confused. The police immediately moved in, arrested him, and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper office, Vlado's editor got another phone call. It was the same police officer who had called before. This time, the officer was calling to say that the arrest had been made. They had their serial killer. And then, he told the editor the name of the person they had arrested. When the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado Tedeschi. It would turn out that Vlado, who appeared so professional and calm on the outside, was a man full of deep-seated rage. Specifically, he was filled with rage towards his own mother, whom he viewed as a terrible, cruel person. After his mother died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with the idea of getting revenge on her, even though she was already dead. The twisted way he decided to do this was by killing random women who looked and lived a lot like his mother. They were poor, they were older, and they were cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Ljubika in 2007, and Zvonka in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. Vlado had used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust. Once he had their trust, he would lure them to a secluded place where he would strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In his explosive newspaper article, Vlado had lied about a number of key details just to throw the police off his trail. For example, he completely made up a witness who claimed to have seen Zvonka get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. This was a total lie, designed to confuse the police and send them looking for 2 non-existent men. Vlado had also been the one to plant the fake story on the radio about Zvonka's son, Zoran, being in a terrible accident. He had called the radio station, and because he had previously worked there, they trusted him and broadcast the story without fact-checking it. That broadcast was an intentional, calculated trap set by Vlado to lure Zvonka out of her house, making her vulnerable so he could abduct and kill her. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was his own arrogance. In the very article he wrote to cover his tracks, he included some very specific details about the murders that the police had not released to the public. For example, Vlado wrote that all three women had been strangled to death with telephone cords and that the cords had been left at the scenes. This was a detail that only the police and the killer could have known. When the police read this in his article, they became extremely suspicious of Vlado. They realized he might not just be a good journalist, he might be the murderer. So, when Vlado thought the police were tailing him to intimidate him, they were actually trailing him because he was their prime suspect. Eventually, they covertly obtained a DNA sample from Vlado, and it was a match to evidence found at the crime scenes. Their suspicions were confirmed. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and police were preparing to charge him with the 3rd. They were even investigating a possible 4th victim. But on June 23rd, just 3 days after his arrest, Vlado died in his jail cell in a way that made no sense. He had somehow drowned in a small bucket of water inside his cell while 3 other cellmates were in there with him. All of them claimed they didn't see or hear it happen. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide. And after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. In the late winter of 1985, a Canadian border security guard was on duty at the crossing between New York State and Ontario, Canada. As he stood in his booth, looking out at the long line of cars waiting to cross, he felt a huge weight of responsibility. For him, the job was about more than just checking passports and asking about duty-free items. It was about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that dangerous criminals from the United States didn't slip across the border and into Canada. And on this particular day, there was one specific dangerous criminal he was on high alert for. His name was Alex Mangal. He was 30 years old. A few days earlier, Alex Mangal had been pulled over by a police officer during a routine traffic stop near New York City. During that stop, something went terribly wrong. Alex had somehow managed to get the officer's gun and had shot the officer in the head, killing him instantly. Alex then fled the scene and had been on the run ever since. Law enforcement was deeply concerned. New York was only about a 6-hour drive from the Canadian border. It was very possible that Alex would try to escape into Canada to avoid being captured. And so, a bulletin had been sent out to all law enforcement and border security on both sides of the border. They were all on the lookout for Alex Mangal, a 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. All day long, that Canadian border guard scrutinized every single person who drove up to his checkpoint. He looked closely at every driver, every passenger, searching for any resemblance to the man in the wanted poster. He saw a family on their way to visit relatives. He saw a young couple who said they were on their honeymoon. He saw a man whose car was packed to the roof with camping supplies. He saw a middle-aged woman who was traveling alone. He saw all these different people from all walks of life, but none of them looked anything like Alex Mangal. By the end of his long shift, after checking dozens and dozens of cars, he felt confident that the dangerous cop killer had not managed to slip through on his watch. He clocked out and went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was patrolling the parking lot of a shopping mall in Ontario, Canada, about an hour-and-a-half's drive from the border. As he made his rounds, he noticed a white Toyota that had been sitting in one spot for quite a while, just loitering. He decided to drive over and check it out. When he got closer, he looked inside the car and saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. It was a white man, probably in his early 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. The officer immediately recognized him. It was the wanted fugitive, Alex Mangal. The officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Then he parked his cruiser, got out, and with his gun drawn, he carefully approached the white Toyota. As he got near the passenger side door, the man inside turned and saw him. Instantly, the man jumped into the driver's seat, started the car, and the Toyota screeched out of the parking lot. The officer sprinted back to his own car and took off in pursuit. Before long, it seemed like the entire police force in the area had joined the high-speed chase. They managed to funnel the speeding Toyota into a dead-end street. The car crashed into a stop sign, and the man with the thinning brown hair and mustache jumped out. Everyone could see it was him. It was Alex Mangal. He didn't put up a fight this time. He was surrounded and quickly taken into custody. Law enforcement was relieved to finally have this dangerous man off the streets. But they were also baffled by one major question. How did Alex Mangal get into Canada? The border was on high alert. Every guard was looking for him. How did he get past them? The police had no idea until they searched the white Toyota that Alex had been driving. It turned out that on the night Alex shot and killed the police officer, he had fled into a wooded area and hidden there overnight. The next day, he was walking around and happened to pass by a commercial building. He saw a middle-aged woman named Beverly Capone come out of the building by herself and walk towards her car. Alex approached her, abducted her at gunpoint, and forced her to drive to an isolated cabin he knew about deep in the woods. Once they got there, he murdered her. After she was dead, he did something truly monstrous. He stole her clothes and put them on. Then he cut off her face and her scalp, and he put those on as well. He was literally wearing her skin and her hair as a disguise. He got into her car, that white Toyota, and he drove all the way up to the Canadian border. Incredibly, he got through the checkpoint without anyone suspecting a thing. That border guard, who had been so diligently checking every car for Alex Mangal, had in fact seen Alex Mangal. He just didn't recognize him. Because Alex Mangal was disguised as Beverly Capone. The guard saw what he thought was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he waved him right on through. The police figured all of this out when they searched the Toyota. Lying on the floorboard of the car, they found Beverly's dress, her scalp, and her face. Alex was deported back to the United States to face justice. However, before he could stand trial, he attempted to escape from a prison transport bus. In the process, he was shot and killed by police. But that wasn't the end of Alex's story. Following his death, investigators continued to look into his past and searched his property. During that search, they found a collection of photos of unidentified women. They also found maps of New York and Pennsylvania with several very isolated locations circled. Nobody knows what these maps or photos mean. While police have never conclusively linked Alex Mangal to any other murders, he remains a person of interest in several cold cases. Many investigators believe that he wasn't just a cop killer on the run, but that he was actually a serial killer. But we will probably never know for sure how many people he killed. He took all of his secrets with him to the grave. On the morning of the 2nd of February 2012, a young man pulled his car off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, and into a large, snowy parking lot. He drove past dozens of parked cars until he reached a small, standalone shack painted a bright teal color. This was a popular drive-through coffee shop called Common Grounds, and the young man worked there as a barista. After he parked, he walked up to the white employee entrance door at the back of the little building. He took out his key and went to unlock it, but as he turned the key, he realized the door was already unlocked. He found that a little strange. He knew the person who had worked the closing shift the previous night. She was an 8-year-old named Samantha Koenig. She had only been working at Common Grounds for about a month, but she seemed very responsible and had never made a mistake like forgetting to lock up before. The young man shrugged it off. People make mistakes, he figured, and he pushed the door open and went inside. Right away, he noticed that several things seemed out of place. The small interior of the kiosk was messy. It looked like Samantha must have left in the middle of her shift without even starting her closing duties. There were napkins scattered on the floor, cleaning towels were left out on the counters, and used cups were still sitting by the espresso machine. As the young man walked over to the cash register to get it ready for the day, he tried to run through scenarios in his head. Maybe she had a family emergency and had to leave in a hurry. He reached down with his key to unlock the register, and just like the front door, it was already unlocked. When he pulled the cash tray out, he saw that all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his boss. The night before, Samantha had made plans with her boyfriend, Dwayne. She had asked him to pick her up after her shift at Common Grounds. Dwayne had gotten held up at his own job, so he didn't arrive at the coffee kiosk until about 8:30 p.m., a full 30 minutes after her shift was supposed to have ended. When he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around but didn't see Samantha anywhere. The coffee shop itself was completely dark. It looked like it had been closed up for the night. Dwayne got out of his truck into the freezing cold Alaskan air and walked up to the service window of the kiosk. He pressed his face against the glass and peered inside, but it was empty. There was nobody in there. Dwayne's mind immediately went to the fight they'd had earlier that night over text message. Samantha had accused him of cheating on her. He had been dismissive about it, which had only made her more upset. It had turned into a really ugly argument. So, as Dwayne walked back to his truck, he thought to himself, maybe Samantha was still angry and just didn't want to see him. Maybe she had called her father or a friend to come pick her up instead, just to avoid him. He got back into his truck and sent a text message to Samantha asking if she was okay and if she had gotten a ride home. But after several minutes passed with no response, Dwayne started to worry. Even though they were fighting, he still cared about her deeply. He decided he had to go by her house just to make sure she was there and that she was safe. A few minutes later, he pulled up to her house and knocked on the door. Her father, James, answered. Dwayne explained that he hadn't seen Samantha after her shift and was just checking to make sure she had made it home okay. But James told him she wasn't there. He said he hadn't spoken to her and had no idea where she was. The two men went into James's kitchen and sat down at the table. They both started calling and texting Samantha, trying to get a hold of her. After a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lit up. It was a text message from Samantha's number. The message made it clear that she was still very upset with him about their fight. She said that she needed some time to think and that she was going to stay with some friends for a couple of days. The message ended by asking if he, Dwayne, would please let her father know where she was. Dwayne showed the text message to James. Samantha's father read it and felt a knot of dread in his stomach. This was very uncharacteristic of his daughter. James had raised Samantha on his own since she was 2 years old, and they were extremely close. They told each other everything. It made no sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to tell him she was going to be with friends for a few days. And it made even less sense that she would be ignoring all of his worried phone calls and texts. The two men stayed up late into the night, calling and texting her, hoping for another response, but she never texted back. The following morning, when neither of them had heard anything more from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving the report, an officer with the Anchorage Police called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. As it turned out, the owner told the officer that they had just received a call from their morning barista who had informed them that the kiosk had been robbed overnight and that no one had been able to get in touch with Samantha. The owner promised the police officer that as soon as they could get the security footage from the previous night, they would send it over to the department. While the police waited for the footage, some officers started calling Samantha's friends and other family members, but no one had seen or heard from her. Other officers went to the Common Grounds kiosk to investigate the scene. They found no signs of a struggle, either inside or outside the small building. They also found a silent panic button installed under the counter, which had not been pressed. And so, even though Samantha's father insisted that her final text message seemed strange and out of character, the police began to operate under the theory that Samantha herself had robbed the kiosk and then had run away on her own accord. But one thing still confounded them. How did she physically get away from the coffee shop? She didn't have a car that night, and the weather was far too cold and miserable for her to have just walked away. Anchorage is not a very walkable city, especially at night in the middle of winter. And if she was really just taking a few days to be with friends, why did none of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop sent over the security footage. And Denver, the footage, which had no audio, began at around 8 p.m. on the night Samantha went missing. It showed Samantha inside the kiosk, working alone. She seemed cheerful and was busy serving customers. At some point, someone who is just outside the camera's range comes up to the service window and orders a drink. Samantha turns to them, acknowledges their order, and then turns back to the espresso machine to make it. After she's finished, she turns back to the window to hand the drink to the customer. But in that instant, her entire body language changes. She immediately steps back and puts her hands up in the air. A few seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside the kiosk. Then, she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, motionless, for about a minute. Then, she slowly stands up and walks down the length of the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it, scoops out all the money, then walks back to the window and appears to hand the cash to a shadowy figure on the other side. Then Samantha turns and kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by. Then the person outside the window leans their entire upper body through the opening and into the coffee shop. They reach down and appear to tie Samantha's hands behind her back. Because it was now dark inside the kiosk, the footage is extremely grainy, making it impossible to identify the person. All that's clear is that it's a male wearing a big dark sweatshirt with the hood up and a hat pulled down low over his face. After the mystery man finishes tying Samantha's hands, he climbs completely through the window, then shuts it behind him. He stands Samantha up, puts a gun into her back, and marches her out the employee door. The camera just barely catches them as they walk across the snowy parking lot to a white pickup truck. He puts her inside, and they drive away. Over the next couple of days, the police and the FBI, who were now involved in the case, kept hitting one dead end after another. They had no physical evidence, no leads. All they had was that grainy surveillance footage that was too poor quality to identify the abductor. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of the entire city of Anchorage to help search for his daughter. His efforts were so massive that they attracted the attention of national news outlets, and soon Samantha's story was making headlines across the country. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to a reward fund for any information leading to her whereabouts. But despite the growing reward and the intense media coverage, no one came forward with any useful information. And there was no word from Samantha or her captor. Then, on February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha had been taken, Dwayne received a text message from Samantha's phone. It gave him directions to a specific sign inside of a nearby public park. Dwayne and James immediately shared the text with the police, and then they raced to the park, actually getting there about 15 minutes before the authorities. They walked through the park gates and down a main trail until they found the sign. It was a community bulletin board. Tacked to the corkboard was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a typed ransom note. And on the note, a black and white photo had been physically Xeroxed onto the paper. It was a picture of Samantha. In the photo, she looked dazed, with a blank expression on her face. She wasn't looking directly at the camera, but just off to the side. And in the picture, a man's hand was holding up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper, dated the 13th of February, 2012. It was a proof-of-life photo meant to show that Samantha was still alive as of that date. For everyone involved, especially her father, seeing that photo was a small glimmer of hope. It was a terrible situation, but at least she was alive just last week. The ransom note demanded that James deposit $30,000 into his daughter's bank account immediately. If he did, she would be released 6 months later. Following the FBI's advice, James deposited a small portion of the ransom money into Samantha's account. Then, the FBI simply waited and watched. They knew that if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they would be able to track the location of the ATM. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made from different ATMs within Anchorage. But each time the FBI got an alert and rushed to the location, the person who had made the withdrawal was long gone. When they reviewed the security footage from the ATMs, the person was a man wearing a ski mask and large sunglasses, making him impossible to identify. After those first 3 withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week. There was no more word from Samantha or her kidnapper. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but this time they were in Arizona, then Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would always arrive just moments after the masked man had left. But this time, they caught a break. In one of the surveillance videos from a Texas ATM, they managed to spot the car the man got into before he drove away. It was a small white sedan, a Ford Focus. They saw him leave heading east on a Texas highway. An alert was put out to law enforcement in that part of Texas to be on the lookout for that car. And on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the white Ford Focus sitting in a hotel parking lot. He parked his cruiser nearby and waited. A short time later, a man in his 30S walked out of one of the hotel rooms and got into the car. The patrolman followed him. He was looking for any reason to pull him over, and soon he got one. His radar gun clocked the man going just 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. That was enough. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The patrolman walked up to the driver's side window. The man inside was very calm. The officer asked for his license. The man handed him an Alaskan driver's license. His name was Israel Keys. He was 34 years old and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was their guy. He called for backup, and soon they were searching Keys' car. In the trunk, they found a ski mask and clothes that matched the description of the man from the ATM videos. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and her debit card. After Keys was arrested and taken into custody, he initially denied having anything to do with Samantha's disappearance. But when he was presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he caved. He said he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but only if they met his demands. He wanted an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers bar, and a cigar. Once he had those items, he began to speak. And what he told them was so disturbing and so graphically violent that to this day, the FBI has not released the full transcript of his confession. What follows is the version of events based on what has been made public. On the 1st of February 2012, Keys had decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting to see a teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He ordered an Americano. But as she turned around to make his drink, his plans suddenly changed. He decided he wasn't just going to steal the money from the coffee shop, he was going to steal Samantha too. When she turned back and handed him his drink, he discreetly pulled out a gun and pointed it at her, telling her it was a robbery. That's when she backed away and put her hands up. He ordered her to turn off the lights, then get on the ground. He tied her hands, then climbed through the window. He said he jammed napkins in her mouth so she couldn't scream. Then he marched her out of the kiosk and into his truck. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth and told her that if she tried to escape or flag anyone down, he would kill her on the spot. He said she was very obedient. She was clearly terrified, but she was trying her best to stay composed. At some point, Keys took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend, Dwayne, telling him she was going to be with friends for a few days. Then Keys told Samantha that he was holding her for ransom. Samantha told him that her family was poor and that he wouldn't get much money from them. Keys replied, "Don't worry about it. I know they'll raise the money somehow." They drove around Anchorage for several hours. Then, around midnight, Keys drove back to his own house. He had Samantha lie down in the back seat, and he covered her with some tarps, warning her again that if she tried to escape, he would kill her. Then, Keys got out of the truck and walked into his house, where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. In just a few hours, Keyes and his daughter were scheduled to leave for a 2-week-long luxury cruise to New Orleans. Keyes went back out to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and led her down the driveway to a shed in his backyard. Once inside, he sat her on an overturned bucket and tied a rope around her neck, anchoring each end to the wall behind her, pinning her in place. He turned on a radio and cranked the volume all the way up to mask any noise she might make. He gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her everything was going to be fine. He said he was going to get the ransom money from her family, and as soon as he did, he would let her go. He turned on a couple of space heaters to keep the shed warm, then he left and locked the door. He went back into his house, double-checked that his daughter and girlfriend were still asleep, then sat down and had a glass of wine. After a little while, he got a cup of water and went back out to the shed. He gave the water to Samantha. He said she was still very composed, though obviously frightened. She asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom?" And Keyes lied to her, saying, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to get the money. We're going to get you out of here." After that, he walked up to Samantha and unscrewed the anchors that were holding the rope against her throat. He cut the zip ties on her wrists, allowing her to relax. It was obvious that Samantha felt a wave of relief. Her nightmare was about to be over. But it was just a cruel trick. A few seconds later, Keyes grabbed her aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more tightly. He just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being set free, when in reality, he never had any intention of letting her go. There was no ransom. He had never spoken to her father. It was all a lie. Keyes told investigators that as he was tying her up that second time, he saw a look of total resignation on her face. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keyes tied her up, he left the shed, locking it behind him. He went inside his house one last time to check on his sleeping daughter and girlfriend. Then he went back to the shed. When he stepped inside, he walked up to her and began to assault her. After he was done, as he was getting dressed, Samantha looked up at him stoically and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" And he said, "Yes, I am." Shortly before 4 a.m., as she tried to talk him out of it, he choked her until she stopped moving. He told investigators she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keyes left her body in the shed and locked it. He went into his house, took a shower, and then woke up his daughter, telling her to get ready for their trip to the airport. While she was getting ready, he went back out to the shed, rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp, and pushed it into a back corner. He unplugged the heaters, turned off the lights and music, and then double-locked the shed door. At 5 a.m., a taxi arrived, and Keyes and his daughter left for the airport and their 2-week vacation. When he returned, he went back to the shed. He unrolled Samantha's body from the tarp. He dressed her in new clothes, put a lot of makeup on her face, braided her hair, and then used thread to stitch her eyelids open to give the impression that she was alive and alert. He held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her and took several photos. This was how he created the proof-of-life photo for the ransom note. After he took the pictures, he dismembered her body and disposed of the pieces in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out that Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed the act of killing. Over the years, he had hidden what he called kill kits all over the United States. These were caches filled with weapons, zip ties, and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, if he got the urge to kill, he could just go to his nearest kit, dig it up, and go hunt for a random stranger. He told investigators that the moment he saw Samantha inside that coffee kiosk, he knew he was going to kill her. The robbery, the ransom, all of it was just an elaborate lie to keep her compliant, to give her false hope that she might survive. In reality, the second she was marched out of that kiosk, her fate was sealed. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha, as well as an older couple in Vermont, but he took his own life in his jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. To this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess, based on a drawing he made in his cell, is 11. But that's just a guess. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.